I surrendered, and then I started to embody a more feminine appearance, but I also started to embody a more feminine appearance before I completely surrendered.
Anneliese from Feminine Not Feminist, thanks so much for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I've gotten so many supportive messages having you on, and I think one of the things that I like so much about what I do with the Renaissance of Men is that the Renaissance of Men includes women, because without women, it's pointless. And so you're one of the voices, in the whole Renaissance of women, if we can call it that I respect and look up to the most. So I'm very grateful that you've made the time to have a conversation with me today, because I think we've got a lot to talk about.
Yes, I've been really looking forward to this. So
awesome. That's great. So I think where I'd like to start is, because this is just my own personal curiosity, is how did you get started with your Instagram page? Because I just showed up on the scene a couple years ago, and then I discovered the whole Renaissance of Women world and found you quite quickly. It's like, this has been kind of going on for a while. So that was the exciting part for me, to see that women were already talking about and thinking about these issues.
Yeah. So I started my page in June of 2020. So it's only been about 2 years.
Oh, wow.
And so, yes, it grew from 0 to 70,000 followers in 1 year.
Wow.
And it just took off. It was insane. And I wasn't expecting that. And so basically, so it was June 2020, and I had gone through just a very, an intense time in my marriage, and an intense time interpersonally, coming face to face with myself. And yeah, so I was, I'd always kind of been interested in sharing my thoughts on an online platform, and I wasn't really sure how do you do that? Like, do you just start a page and start talking?
Sure.
So June 2020, I started it, and actually the name was Radical Submission was my first handle's name.
That's not bad. It's not bad.
I liked it,
yeah.
but then I changed it to Feminine Not Feminist, and I think long term that was a better move. It really just came out of, I would say it came very freshly out of some stuff that had been going on in my own life, and I was like, and I've always been a writer, and so I just took those lessons and turned them into words, and people resonated, and it took off. So.
Can you remember when you started the page, when you first realized, was there like a moment that you posted something and it really took off, and it's like, oh, wow, more people are having these thoughts, where you realize I might actually be onto something? Like 70,000, that's how many is that? That's like 4,000 followers. No, 6,000 followers a month.
Something like that. And
it's wild.
Feel like that to me. I don't know. Yeah. When I look back at the numbers, I'm like, oh, that really was that. I know the first month I grew like 0 to 600 in the first month or something like that.
Sure.
And I was like, cool, this is great. Like, this is a great trajectory. I remember seeing someone share my post, and I was like, oh, that's interesting that they found that worth sharing. Like,
yeah.
So that was a moment that I was like, okay. And then the level of engagement, I think, was what stood out to me, because sometimes you'll see people that have like a ton of followers, but their posts get like 100 likes and a few comments, and the engagement is low. And so I think what stood out to me was, from the very beginning, there was high engagement. That was always very proportionate to my following. And so I realized that it wasn't just people were like casually like, oh, I'm interested in this. No, they were part of something greater. And I think that was what stood out to me, was the level of engagement. Yeah.
And you were getting messages, I'm sure, from people like, oh, I've had the same thoughts. And that must have been quite an experience to recognize that you weren't alone in that.
Yeah, no, it was interesting, because like in my personal life, I have like-minded people. I'm very blessed in that way. But yeah, it just goes to show, like, there's nothing new under the sun. And the fact that you know, because I had some insecurities of like, I'm very young, you know, I was 22 when I started my page, but like truth and wisdom is not, it doesn't discriminate based on age. And so, yeah, there was women much older than me reaching out saying, thank you for sharing this. And I'm learning from you and you could be my granddaughter. And it's just like, whoa.
Wow. Yeah. Because I, without knowing the demographics, like it makes sense. Like there is something going on amongst women, sort of deprogramming from a lot of the feminist kind of lies, like willfully, like this hasn't worked. I never liked it, or I've realized I was wrong. And I guess, hey buddy. So you want to introduce the little guy right there? So cute. So there are so many, I figured that there would be a lot of girls of your generation that would be asking questions about these things, but it's actually, it's surprising and not surprising at all to recognize that you would be getting attention and engagement from women up the generations from you, like even to grandmothers, you said, right?
Yes. Yes. Women in their 60s. And yeah.
What does that look like? Like what sort of things do they share with you? This is fascinating to me because this is a world that I have very limited visibility into, but I know it's going on. It's incredibly exciting.
Yes. So, a lot of the messages are, just extremely encouraging messages from women saying, I've been married 40 years and what you're saying is true.
Wow.
And those are my favorite. You know, yes, it is like, it's really cool to hear someone say, you know, that they're learning from me, even though they've been married so many years. But I really like the messages where someone is saying, everything you've said has proven true in my 30, 40 years of experience in marriage. Keep doing what you're doing. Sorry, he just moved.
It's okay. That's my first baby guest.
Yes.
So you mentioned that some things were going on in your personal life. I know that you've got a podcast now, and you've spoken very vulnerably about some of the things that you've been through with regards to diet and some of the other things in the past, and health challenges to some extent. Would you be interested in talking about some of the stuff that was going on in your personal life related to when you created the page and why you chose the theme that you did? Because like radical submission it's a great title, but maybe better for a book. Feminine Not Feminist, I think, probably sells a little better on social media.
Yes.
So, yeah, right. So like, what sort of things, if you don't mind sharing just a little bit, what was going on then that inspired you to go in this direction?
Yeah, no, I don't mind sharing at all. So my husband and I got married in 2018. And we had some like disagreements, when we were dating about some stuff. And when I tell you what it is, it's very silly stuff. It's like hair, makeup, this kind of stuff, how I would wear my hair, to wear makeup or not to do makeup, whatever. And so, you know, we had some disagreements about this when we were dating. Mm-hmm. And I had an awareness of, even when I was 19, 20, because we started dating when I was 19, I had an awareness by the grace of God of like, this is my husband, and like, I'm going to honor his preferences. I'm going to, let me move him. Sorry.
It's okay.
I'm going to honor his preferences. And like, when you get married, it's not just about what you want to do. So I understood that. But when I got married, I started dealing with like extreme bitterness. And it was like to this point that I was like, something is wrong, that I feel so bitter about like my husband having like simple requests. Like, this really isn't about hair or makeup or whatever. So for context, I don't wear makeup. My husband does not like makeup. He doesn't want me to wear makeup. And I didn't really care at the beginning. And then when we were married, it was like, just being told what I should or shouldn't do.
Yeah.
And that's why I say it sounds silly, right? Because we're talking about makeup or hair or the clothing that I would wear. Okay. It's really not about that.
Right.
It's about like belonging to someone else, and this idea that I was not completely autonomous anymore.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So that was I think the heart of my struggle. He's just being so cute. But yeah, so we got married in 2018, and these discussions kept resurfacing, and every time they would resurface, they would just get more and more heated and aggressive and difficult. And I don't mean like physically aggressive, but just like verbally aggressive. And so I remember that I was going to all sorts of women and wasn't really discriminating, like, oh, this is someone who I was kind of just going to anyone and anyone who would listen to me. I was in a very vulnerable place, and I just wanted someone to like give me an answer. And the amount of bad advice that I got is shocking. And I remember a friend of mine, she listened to me. I kind of shared like some stuff, and she was like, just submit to your husband. And I was like, that's all you're going to tell me? But it was the only advice that actually made sense. So our marriage was like up and down depending on like me. You know, it was my temperament and my, how submissive I wanted to be or whatever. It was very up and down. And it was March, I believe, of 2020. We were talking about something, and it was raining outside, and we lived with a family that like lived on a farm. So there was like mud everywhere. And this has a point.
That's great. Go ahead.
So we got out of the car after fighting, and I rolled in a pile of mud.
Yeah.
So I look back at that as like a pinnacle moment because I had hit rock bottom, and I rolled in a pile of mud, and it was yeah, I was like, I don't know what kind of bacteria and things are in this, but it's probably like duck poop. Yeah. And then that night, so yeah, I was just in the mud, and then I was kind of just like walking around crying, and we lived with a family at the time, and the husband comes out and he's like, are you okay? And I'm like, no, I'm not really okay. But I said, I think I need to just go in, shower, eat some chocolate, and go to bed. Anyway, I only bring that up to say that was, I would say, a moment that I hit rock bottom, quite literally. I rolled in mud. And then it was really only up to go from there. And so it's funny how like we grow as people, because sometimes the stories we hear are like, this happened and then I changed. But it's often more just like this. You're slowly going up, but there's downs. So that incident, and then I really started to dig into 1 Peter 3, which really cool story, but I had started memorizing 1 Peter years ago. I had just picked it randomly to start memorizing. And then I had no idea that God was going to use that memorization, because that is like the one verse. I mean, there's multiple verses, but that is the one verse that changed everything for me. And so, it says, wives, be subject to your own husbands. Or so it says, wives, be subject to your own husbands. So that if any do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives when they see your pure and respectful conduct. Do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair, the putting on of gold jewelry, but let your adorning be the inner person of the heart, with the beauty of a quiet and gentle spirit, the imperishable beauty of a quiet and gentle spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. And then it goes on to say, and this is what just blew my mind. It goes on to say, for this is how the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves, by submitting to their own husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. And you are her children if you do good and do not fear anything that is frightening. I cannot tell you how mind-blowing that was, because my argument in my marriage was about makeup, hair, clothes, this silly stuff. And the text literally says that the best adornment that a woman can have is to submit to her own husband. So that all just came to a pinnacle moment or series of moments where I was like, I am just tired of doing things my way. I'm tired of fighting. I'm tired of being disrespectful, dishonoring. I was just tired of it. And like, I knew that it was not pleasing to the Lord. So I started that page really very freshly coming out of that place. And so these posts, you know, they were not these like high and lofty, I'm telling you what to do. This was like, I am in the trenches with you. Like, I just spoke disrespectfully to my husband. And so now I'm going to go make something of it. And I'm going to write a post about why it's wrong and it's hurtful. So I think a lot of people might have come on at the beginning and this thought like, wow, she's arrived. And like I've always said from the beginning, I am not arrived. I am simply putting words to the mistakes that I have made and continue to make. So yeah, that was the whole story. So
that's beautiful. That's really, I mean, so much of the things that I think both, I know the men that I know that we teach are born out of our own mistakes, right? Yes. Like I don't hold myself up as like, I'm some paragon icon of masculinity. Like I'll show you a photo of me a few years ago, you know, and it's definitely not that. Like, you know, but we all must make mistakes and we grow, and it's from growing from those mistakes and making them in the first place that we learn what it actually is to do things correctly. And in that we become teachers, right?
Yes.
And I think what really resonates for me from what you were saying is the feeling of grief from having lived out of alignment for so long that maybe you yourself weren't necessarily in touch with.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting because I got married young. I got married at 20. And the shock of going from doing whatever I wanted, even though I was only 20 when I got married. And that's what I find interesting is because I've talked to friends who, you know, they're almost in their 30s or in their 30s, and they say, it's going to be difficult when I get married because I've been doing things my own way for so long. And I experienced that, and I was only 20, and I met my husband at 17. Like, this is, you know, and so to realize how deep the programming is, that a 20-year-old new wife is still hardcore having to unlearn that. That's crazy to me.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, that's the biblical curse, right? Like it is I was writing today for a post that I'm working on that like feminism is the biblical curse on overdrive, right? It just feeds all into that where it's like
the philosophical manifestation of the curse.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Socialized, like made it into a political force, a social force, a culture and everything. So it makes sense that as you would get into like, that's, you know, your desire will be for your husband and he shall rule over you. Like the very fact of getting married will activate that, right? It seems to me that would be the case, right?
Yes. Because it was interesting how I was willing to submit when we were dating. And
yeah.
You're right.
Yeah.
And then in engagement, the bitterness started to turn up. And then in marriage, it was just aggressively agitated. And I didn't share this part, but I read a book that a friend gave me. It's actually a single friend, never been married. And she was like, I think this book would be good for you. And it was called The Abusive Wife. And I was like, oh, okay. But there was a chapter in there about bitterness, and the point that this. Sorry.
Oh, buddy, it's okay.
You want to play with the speaker? Want to play with the mic? Ooh.
Interesting. Yeah, exactly.
The point that this chapter made, and this was a biblical counselor who wrote this book. But the point that he made was that bitterness is the most destructive thing that you can have in a marriage. Because once you go down the path of bitterness, Like,
Yeah.
if you do not do full stop, turn yourself around, repent, and leave that bitterness behind, it's a dangerous, dangerous, destructive path. And I read that and I realized, oh, I'm on that path of bitterness. And he gave examples of women that he had met through counseling, he had counseled a lot of men who were married to like abusive, bitter women. And so he gave stories. And what you see with women who become excessively bitter is that they become literally mad. They become crazy.
Mm-hmm.
And they are controlled and governed by those emotions. And I saw that trajectory in myself, as much as I hate to admit it. And I was just like, I need to run in the opposite direction. So help me God, like, help me, Lord, because this is the path I'm going down.
Wow.
So yeah, I wanted to also add that there's a lot of things that culminated in my page, but those are some key moments.
That's very brave to admit that. And I want to talk about that bravery in just a second, because I think it's important. But, you know, getting married at 20, like a lot of women, by the way, men suffer from bitterness too. Like, well, don't I know it? So like, this isn't just a one-sided thing. It shows up differently in men. But like a lot of women, they say that their bitterness is legitimate because of past treatment by dads or ex-boyfriends or something like that. And I don't know whether that's the case for you, but it almost seems like at age 20, like the bitterness isn't like, well, because such and such happened in my past. It just seems like something that kind of emerged out of you organically on its own. Like that was part of you as opposed to tied to anything from the past.
Yes. And that's absolutely correct. I have incredible brothers, an incredible father.
Wow.
Who I have an amazing relationship with. This is the thing. Yes, I had dated some guys before. They were both nice guys that there was no issue with. We just didn't work out, you know. There was no reason
Mm-hmm.
to be bitter. I will say, and this is where I think a lot of the bitterness was actually talking to other women and receiving the things that they were saying about marriage or their husbands or my husband. And I think, yes, the bitterness was already there, but it was really fostered by not talking to the right people, which is scary. And, but those women themselves, it's not necessarily bitterness because of a bad past event or relationship. It's also ingrown, but women feed it when they have these toxic, you know, So yes, I absolutely agree with that. It was activated by marriage. And then I was forced to deal with it.
Wow. That's really heavy. Like I'm going to sit with that for a while because, these notions of biblical curses, like once I really landed in that and had an understanding of you know, what earth was when it was a paradise and how grievous, you know, our sin was in Adam and Eve and how legit God's curses were. Like,
yes.
Right. You know, but the thing is like, I'm not a woman, right? Obviously. So I know what it is to suffer under the male curse, which is, you know, rather than tending to this beautiful, overflowing, abundant garden, men have to fight against the earth to produce prosperity and, you know, sweat of your brow and all that. But to actually hear you describe that as you enter into marriage, that the poison of this curse surfaces organically within you simply by virtue of making the commitment to a husband, that's heavy. That's wild.
Yeah. And that's what I meant when I was saying earlier that I came to a place of coming face to face with myself.
Right.
Interpersonally and realizing, like, I always knew I was a sinner, but I was like, oh, I am a sinner. Like, and
me too.
Yeah. I just remember listening to this Keith Green has a great rendition of Psalm 51. Created me a clean heart, oh God. I just remember listening to that and just bawling my eyes out one night. and yeah, it's repentance is not it's no joke.
It's not a joke. I was thinking that the repentance is no joke.
It's intense.
It's intense. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, to really dig into like these feelings that are in you they're part of you, but they're kind of not of you, but they've driven your behavior, your thoughts, your words, and your actions, and your treatment of a man that you love. Like that's like
Great.
fall on your knees stuff.
I love.
Yeah.
And the man that I chose to spend the rest of my life with. Why would I start suddenly, of all people, like directing that bitterness towards him?
Yeah.
Like it doesn't make sense. And sin doesn't make sense.
Right.
But yeah, and then the way that it starts to that bitterness when it's directed towards your own husband, and then you start to see other men and think, well, they're not like my husband. You know, they're different.
Yeah. Grass is greener.
The grass is greener.
Mm.
Featuring my baby eating my hair.
I love it. It's great. It's beautiful.
So yeah, it's like curse upon curse. I mean, it's just, and I would say that was my first 2 years of marriage was just like this intense coming to face with the reality of my sin. And I realized if I'm going through this, other people are going through this. Mm-hmm. And turns out they were.
To a pretty amazing degree. But that you're able to talk about it. This is the bravery part, is that you're able to talk about it from the other side of it. Like I'm sure it's still a part of you, as our curses are always going to be a part of us. But it feels to hear you talk about it that you're removed from it. Like you were down in it, like rolling in the mud of it, and now you're not in the mud of it anymore.
I'm not in the mud of it. I have noticed that there are times when, for instance, having a baby is a huge life change.
I've heard.
We were married for a few years before we had a baby. And so big life changes or things like that will kind of trigger old habits. But now I can go, okay, I'm descending into those old habits. I'm descending into those old patterns.
Wow.
And so and honestly, just recently I had I see I'm going down a trajectory. I need to stop. Ask God for forgiveness, repent. But I'm quicker to see it now. And that's by the grace of God. But yeah, events that are just more stressful, you know, or just the fact of having a new baby and being sleep deprived and not having as much time with your spouse and stuff like that. So yes, I would say, yes, there is a sense in which I'm removed from that deep, deep, dark place. But I remember it was Brendan Schmidt. He did a post on something. I know that guy. Yeah, he's great. And he did a post and I was reading and I was like, oh, okay, I was like, I need to be reminded of this because you can always fall back into toxic old habits. Mm-hmm. So yes, yeah, I would say that I don't want ever to present myself as have arrived because I have not.
Right. Well, so what is your husband's experience of this been? Because it sounds to hear you describe a scenario, it's that you were going into marriage or you were already married and you were kind of bristling at the notion that you didn't have your full autonomy anymore. And you went to women for advice and they activated this bitterness and you're like, yeah, you know what? That does kind of suck. And, you know, and sort of like brought this up in you. And meanwhile, your husband is going through this and how is he being through it? Like, he's like, what's going on? Things are going insane. Or is, you know, like what was his experience? Because I want to get to like, what's the experience of marriage like for you now without these aspects? Hey, buddy.
You okay? You want to sit down and play with some toys? Yeah, so I think from his perspective, like, it was like, what is wrong with my wife?
Oh,
like,
sure.
I thought she loved me. And of course I'm like, yes, of course I love you. And then my actions are saying something different and just sort of like, just shutting down because if my wife's going to act this way, I'm not going to put myself out there. I'm just going to shut down. And the thing about when that happens is then the wife is like, you're shutting down on me. You're not being emotionally available. He's like, well, I'm shutting down because you're treating me like you don't love me. And it's a vicious cycle.
Yep.
Like, yeah, I laugh because you laugh or you cry. You know what I mean? It's
Yeah.
just, so I would say from his perspective, I mean, I'd have to ask him to get but I think
Sure.
he would say, yeah, you just shut down. Like, and he does not have, a great family background. So when I would treat him in a certain way, it would break stuff up. So it was compounding a lot of things. So yeah, I would say his main response would just be like, to be cautious with me, because women can be very emotionally unstable and volatile. And how do you respond to someone that you don't know how they're going to treat you?
Mm-hmm.
Which is like, it's painful for me to say that because I know that's what I've done. Like, it's painful. But yeah. And to be perfectly honest with you, because I have no interest in not being perfectly honest, we are still working through repercussions of my emotional volatility.
Wow.
And again, it's just like, I see things now when I'm heading down a trajectory and I more quickly turn away from it. But yeah, God did not choose me to have this platform because I'm good at it. God chose me because I will be honest and and be able to articulate what's going on. Like my point being, we're still working through some of those consequences, because you can't just live in bitterness for so long and then just turn around like that.
That's really beautiful. Thank you for saying that, because I think a lot of people listening can probably hear reflected a lot of dynamics in their own relationships. I certainly can see them in some past relationships that I've had, where it's like, where is all this anger at me coming from? Okay. And now I'm going into a guarded, protective kind of state. And then she's like, well, why are you shutting down now? I'm someone that can force myself to be open, but there has definitely been moments where it's like, why am I going to open up and be, and here's the word, vulnerable? And there's so much chastisement to men to be vulnerable, but it's like men are putting themselves at risk for that same attacking bitterness. And men aren't stupid, right? We know when we feel that, but we're not actually allowed to say anything, because here comes some more words: feminism, patriarchy, like ex-boyfriends or whatever. It's like, what does any of that have to do with me? You chose to be with me, and that's, but here's the tricky part, is that those things are real, but that you didn't have any of those experiences and you still felt the bitterness to your husband. That's legit. Like, that's real.
That's garden stuff.
Yeah.
Garden of Eden stuff.
Yeah.
And yes, I had feminist programming by virtue of living in a feminist influenced society.
Culture, yeah.
Yeah. But I have never called myself a feminist. I think I was even in like high school, I was like, women getting the vote, I wouldn't have been the ones fighting for that. Like,
we're going to both get canceled. Awesome.
Yeah, that's fine.
Wait a minute.
I just never resonated with the feminist message.
Sure.
And then I started to resonate with it after I got married. And not like feminism.
Right.
Not like feminism, like shave your head and like just be fat and like that. I mean, I never wanted that, but like, you hear it all the time: my body, my choice. And it's that autonomy thing.
Yes.
And like coming face to face with the Bible being like, the wife's body does not belong to herself. It belongs to her husband, and the husband's body does not belong to himself. It belongs to his wife. There is no bodily autonomy there.
That's right.
And I could flesh that out more. It's because people could misunderstand whatever, but that's what the text says. And so I think yes, there was feminist programming. But the feminist programming appealed to me more after marriage. which is, again, just goes to show that the curse is something that is alive and well and ready to strike when we give it the opportunity.
Mm-hmm. And the thing is, without Christ, there's no incentive to do anything about it. Right?
Exactly. Without the gospel, why get married? Why, yeah. And that's all to say, like, it's, I never gave up on my faith when I was going through my rough time, but I had some moments because my faith in Christ and my relationship to my husband were so integrated, and people love to they love to say these very dichotomous things like, don't love your husband more than you love God, and don't make an idol out of him, and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, let's think about this. The way that you treat your husband is a direct reflection of your relationship with God.
Yes.
And it is not this false dichotomy. And so I always just like cringe when I would hear that kind of thing. Because yes, we can make anything an idol, but making your husband an idol I was making it an idol of him when I was being bitter towards him, because I was expecting things from him that only Christ could give me. I was demanding things of him. That's what idolatry looks like. It doesn't look like, oh, I just love you so much and you're amazing. No, that is beautiful and God glorifying. But to go back to what I was saying is I never gave up on my faith. But there were moments where I was like, I recognized that to walk out on my husband would be to walk out on my God. And that's when I realized, like, I'm treading dangerous waters, because the thoughts of unfaithfulness to my husband would correspond to thoughts of apostasy and unfaithfulness to Christ.
Wow.
So
that's awesome. That's not awesome,
man,
but you get what I mean.
I am rehashing some things right now.
Go for it.
Yeah. So, but yeah. And I would just have these moments where it was like, so what am I, what am I hanging on for? And I mean, my verse has always been when Jesus is talking to his disciples and he says to Peter, because Jesus had just said, if you drink, you must drink my blood and eat my flesh, and all these people leave him. And then he says to his disciples, are you going to leave me too? And Peter's like, where else are we going to go? You have the words of eternal life. And that was the place where I was like, well, no, I'm not walking out, because Jesus has the words of eternal life. And so I'm also not walking out of my marriage because, like, he commands me to be faithful. But there were some intense moments of extreme bitterness, constant thoughts of adultery and unfaithfulness, just all swirling together in this big mess that it was. So
that's very powerful. That's very powerful, because I can feel that as you talk about it, that how abandoning your husband, about how being unfaithful to your husband would go right along inside yourself in terms of being unfaithful to your God, that they would be interlinked, that they wouldn't be separate.
Yes.
And that to betray one would be to betray the other, and obedience to one is obedience to the other, despite your own bitterness and desire to disobey both. Right? Because, hath God really said in the garden, and then you have feminism out there in the world. It's like, divorce your husband, no fault divorce. Just leave because you feel like it. Find another guy, you got time, right? That's
it was intense because I was still like in the workforce at this time, the workforce.
Sure. The workforce. Yes.
It was intense because I was still working. I was working at a grocery store, and I was getting constant attention from men. And so there was this realization that, like, I was like, I could if I want to. And it was this, it was this awful thing. It wasn't until I stopped working as much and, like, I just slowly began to, like, become at home more. I healed so much.
Okay.
When I was working a lot in the workplace, and like, oh man, it was very, very it was very bad because, so I'm treating my husband a certain way. So he withdraws, right?
Yep.
And so then I don't get the attention that I want from him. So then I'm in the workplace and I'm getting this attention and I'm thinking, I'm getting more attention from these people, from my own husband, but I'm also not treating my husband in such a way that he's going to be vulnerable. Mm-hmm. So so I started slowly just being at home more. And that was a very, very good thing for us. I actually left a job partly because I didn't like it, but partly because I was like, I can't be around this one individual and it's like, I didn't think about this kind of stuff when I was single.
Sure.
So, it clearly is, it's like, it's more than just about like, it's not really about wanting to actually go out and cheat. It's about that dynamic in your marriage where you're coming face to face with the curse, the fall. So
this is incredible. This is a really important conversation to me because I spend a lot of time thinking about these things, trying to understand the way that the curse is really legit but I can only understand it so far from an outside perspective, looking into the inner life of a woman. But it sounds to me that what you're describing is so much more complex than even I had realized naturally, because, so you're shutting down your relationship with your husband, you're feeling rebellious, you're feeling bitter, and that's showing up in the home. And then you're going out there into the workforce and you're being exposed to other men who are offering you attention. And that's kind of like turbocharging what you're already going through. And that's the state that most women are in.
Yes, that I just summed up. You just summed up. Like, this is our current situation.
Wow.
No wonder affairs are so rampant, and there's movies about them and it's glamorized, and yeah.
Wow. Yeah, there's a guy, Professor E. Michael Jones, Dr. E. Michael Jones. He wrote a book called Libido Dominandi about how sexual liberation was a project that had been worked on, I don't know, for something like 100 years before they finally pulled it off in the 1960s, and how sexual liberation is what you get in exchange for true freedom. Like, they take away your true civil liberties and they give you sexual liberation instead. And so what he talks about is how long this project had been going on to celebrate adultery. Just like you said, he listed a whole bunch of very famous novels where it's like the entire plot of this novel revolves around adultery. Like Anna Karenina, I think, is one that he talked about.
Right. Yes.
Right? It's like it's all about adultery. And even the book Pride and Prejudice, right? I love that book. By Jane Austen. Like, it's not exactly adultery, but there's like some sexual liberation that shows up and it almost destroys the whole family, right?
Yeah.
And just how much of this had been going on. And now we're kind of living in the ashes of it. Like, there's a giant explosion and now we just kind of take for granted, like, oh yeah, no, this is just normal.
Yes. Yeah. And, and to realize that I am a Christian citizen. I'm a citizen of the kingdom of God, but I'm living in the kingdom of man and the kingdom of darkness. And so sometimes those messages are very hard it's hard to step outside of and be like, wait a minute, this is just propaganda from the kingdom of darkness. And that's all it is. But when you are in a vulnerable, just a really dark place, things start to get meshed and you start to doubt. And that was the place I was in, for sure.
And these are the messages that people, they don't really like to hear. This is the, I guess, the paradox that I don't get caught in it because it's not a paradox, but in the social media world, it would seem to be a paradox that what we're talking about, what you're saying, is such an incredible incrimination of everything that we've been growing up in for the past 2 or 3 generations, right? That women in the workforce, women even voting, right, as well, that all these things feed in feminism, like the way that we've constructed our entire culture, adultery, Sex and the City, you name it, all is constructed in such a way to exacerbate the curse in the garden, right? And that our world is completely upside down, and it's such a strict incrimination of it. And a lot of people say, oh, don't go too hard on that. But your success proves that, like, people need to hear this stuff. Not only do they need to hear it, they want to hear it, and not just men, but women too. And that's why I call it a paradox. It's like so many people are so resistant to this, but 6,000 followers a month over the course of a year that's wild.
Yeah.
And you've doubled that. You've doubled that.
And really, I'm just saying obvious things. Like to go back to what you were saying of it's such a stark contrast from what people are being told. And so they log on, they see someone say, honor your husband.
What?
Here are 5 ways you can honor your husband today.
Burn it down.
And it's like, this is really not that novel, but yet it is so profound, because what you have is women, who watched their parents convey a completely opposite dynamic. Their mother never honored their father. Their mother ran the show with her emotions. Her father was unkind in return, like this whole thing. And so they go on social media and they see women saying, respect your husband and cook for your husband. It's like, what?
Yeah. Well, you tweeted, you posted on Instagram is where I saw it. You said, normalize being nice to the person you married.
It's so funny. I tweeted that and I left it alone. I forgot about it. And then I went on Twitter and I was like, oh, why do I have all these reshares? Oh, I guess people really resonate with this. Because I found this page where this woman makes lunches for her husband and it's great. She just puts the thing, time to make lunch for my husband. And she responds to these stupid comments. And I'm like, people are really out here angry because this woman made her husband a nice sandwich. Like, they're angry about that. Yeah. They're mad. And I mean, obviously there's going to be a lot, there's more going on, if that kind of thing just deeply just bothers you so much. But to realize that you don't really need to you don't need to do much to be really countercultural today. Mm-hmm. I mean, the upheaval when I would talk about things that I would do for my husband, like I would dress a certain way for my husband, or I wouldn't wear makeup for my husband. The amount of messages I would get. Well, what about you? What about your personal preferences? What is he doing for you? It just really draws out something in people.
Well, let's talk about the makeup issue, because I actually did get a message. I did get a message about that. Someone wrote to me, it's like, and I won't caricature the voice. It was a very sincere message. It's like, she doesn't represent a lot of moms out there. And I said, it's not my purpose to represent all the moms out there. Like I have conversations with people that I respect and that I think are making interesting contributions. And I don't think you're saying like everyone needs to be just like me. Like I think that you're living a certain way and using your life as an example. Take from it what you will. But let's talk about the makeup issue. Let's talk about the clothes issue, because, makeup and clothes are a big part of let's say women's culture in America today. And how did you resolve that? And how does that feel? And where are you at with it now?
Yeah. Well, I just kind of did whatever. I was never like big into makeup or like big into the beauty industry. Like that was just not, it's expensive and whatever. Like I've maybe had 2 pedicures in my entire life. But it was, again, to go back to the autonomy thing, I believe that women should be well dressed and like putting some effort into their appearance. But I look at it through the context of their marriage, like, because there's a lot of, and I'm not sure if this is the route you were going with this conversation, but let's
go that way.
Let's go this way. So, when I've talked about these things, I'll say, this is where I'm at, but do what honors your husband. If he likes you to wear makeup, I think you should wear makeup. Mm-hmm. So I'm not sure if that's how I don't represent mothers in that I don't have a real glamorous lifestyle whatsoever. Like I live with my parents. I don't wear makeup. I'm very simple. But
those are good things. Those are maybe not for everyone living with the parents, but like the living a simple lifestyle. Like a lot of people work real hard to live a simple lifestyle.
They work really hard to live a simple lifestyle. But yeah, so so with the hair and makeup thing of like, I think that this is where maybe I diverge with the trad community or whatever.
Okay.
And well, let me put it this way. I used to get really triggered by messages when women would make posts about like, look nice for your husband, put on some makeup before he goes home, he comes home, things like that. I used to get really triggered by that because I was like, but my husband doesn't like that.
Fair.
And so, and so now I can just like see it and be like, the principle is to look nice for your husband, like whatever that looks like in your marriage. For him, because that's the whole point. And so if someone sees me and says she doesn't, and that's fine. Like I'm sure I don't represent a lot of moms. I also don't like really talk about motherhood a whole lot because I'm very new,
Right.
But if someone sees my page and is like, I don't know, it doesn't really fit the thing, I'm like, well, it fits what works for my husband. And that's the whole point I'm trying to get across.
Mm-hmm. And that's a better point anyway.
And that's the better point anyway, because, and you can hold that. I've learned to hold that piece without being judgmental of the woman who is, puts a lot of time into her hair, her makeup, her appearance, her clothing. I can see that and be like, I'm sure she is doing that out of honor for her husband, and she represents a certain segment, and there's nothing wrong with that. And so just to be at peace with that. But yeah, I had a lot of, it was a struggle for me because I have a history of eating disorder. And so, this whole topic of beauty, which is forefront of every woman's mind. And so it was very difficult when I got married, and it was like all the things that were beautiful to my husband were not beautiful societally. And so my
praise God for that.
And I'm like, yes, right. And it's so funny because I think there are women that would be like, that is amazing. Like your husband thinks you're beautiful without makeup. That's so cool. And I'm like, yes, it is. But at the time I was like, it was basically, who am I pleasing? Am I here to please my husband, or am I here to please the world? And that was, it was hard to realize that, yeah, I was desiring more to please the world. So yeah, I don't know if that answers the question, but with the whole makeup and that conversation, and this is something that Christiana and I have talked about, dear sister, if you're familiar with her.
She's amazing.
She's amazing. We've talked about this a lot. All of those conversations have to be had in the context of one's marriage, because really it's about making yourself beautiful for the man that you're married to, and tuning out the voices of the world in order to do that well. And if that means that everyone around you is telling you to be like plain Jane, and your husband wants you to put more effort into it, you need to tune out those voices. But in my case, I had to tune out like the entire beauty industry. I had to tune out the people that I was, and just, and here's the thing too that really gets people is, it's not like my husband said, you must not wear makeup. Like, it's not like he came and said, this is a commandment, right?
Right.
It was, I very much prefer when you don't. I still love you if you do, obviously, but I feel loved and I find you beautiful when you don't wear makeup and don't, and grow your hair long and things like this. And so it wasn't that I was like, people are like, oh, so he just, forced you to, no, he told me his preference and I chose to do that. But in order to do that with peace in my soul, I had to tune out a lot of voices, and I still have to tune out a lot of voices. And that includes the entire sphere I'm in on social media, which really can emphasize things like, external signs of beauty. So do you get what I'm saying?
I do.
Yeah. So, and that's why I look at it and I'm like, it's so ironic that like, well, it's just funny that God like gave me the platform he did, because It's just like the opposite of, but the point, it all goes back to that verse in First Peter I mentioned, like, this is how the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves, by submitting to their own husbands. And I also noticed, and this is sort of strange, and maybe it's kind of like unprovable, but I actually, like, as I started to heal in my marriage and honor my husband's preferences, I started becoming more beautiful to myself. I don't know if I became more beautiful in anyone else's eyes, but I look at old pictures and I look at myself now and I'm like, I'm a much more beautiful woman. And that's because I'm not harboring that bitterness, and it's because I'm submitting to my husband. So it's the ultimate beauty.
Peace, like a gentle, quiet spirit. And I think this is something, what I'm really, I'm enjoying many things about this conversation, but one of the things that I'm really enjoying is getting a sense of the perspective of the number of fallen influences that women are subjected to. So you have the bitterness of women around you. Set aside the own curse surfacing from within your own body and being and your own soul. Like, you have the influences of women around you. You have cultural influences. You have the beauty industry that's portraying what beauty should be, right? That's telling you what beauty should be, perhaps from some commercial angle. But my experience is that First Peter says that, like, a gentle and quiet spirit is probably the most beautiful thing in the universe to a man, right? And to achieve that, for a woman to be like Alison Armstrong, who I love, she has a great line in her book, The Queen's Code, about how men draw strength from a contented woman. And which wouldn't necessarily be obvious to him, like just a man being around a contented woman. And when I read that the first time, like it like broke me, because I recognized how true that was and how rare that I had experienced it. So it makes sense that as you find a place of peace within yourself, for your being, your life, and the way that you've constructed your life right now, that the beauty would naturally surface, as opposed to trying to pretend in all these different directions the world is trying to drive you.
Yes, absolutely. That's well said.
So talk a bit about that experience, the shift that you've felt from this phase of bitterness. Like, you must notice an everyday kind of difference in yourself. Like, yes, there are ups and downs and challenges, but like, what's your experience of being like, I guess we might say?
Yeah. Oh man, how do I want to answer this?
Well, let's answer it two ways. You can answer it pre having a child and post, because I think there's probably going to be some amount of difference.
There's some differences. So this goes into other things.
Cool.
My journey of becoming more peaceful and submissive in my marriage has corresponded with my journey of becoming at peace with being a woman and really, like, leaning into my femininity.
Oh, wow.
And so I would say, if we want to talk about where, like, having a child comes into this, it's interesting when I look back on the timing of everything, because 2020, June of 2020, I started my page, and December of 2020 was when my husband said, okay, I think we're ready to start trying to have a child. And so he obviously felt that kind of peace that he didn't feel before.
Oh, got it.
Ready to start a family.
And you got married in 2018.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And then April, I got pregnant. And it's like life came out of that piece, because like, that was when my husband was like, just all of a sudden was like, yeah, like, we're ready, you know? And so, and then pregnancy. So we found out I was pregnant in the end of April. Yes. Sweetheart.
Speaking of life coming out of peace.
Speaking of life. So the end of April, I found out I was pregnant, and that entire year, I was very disconnected from, like, the pregnancy process in my first trimester. I had very, very bad, like, pregnancy denial. Like, I didn't think it was real.
Never even heard that term before.
Yeah, no, it was
Is that a thing?
I don't know. I think
Okay.
that I had convinced myself for so long, like, oh, we're never going to get pregnant. Like, it just,
Oh, I see.
that when we actually did and it happened pretty fast, I was like, what? Um, and so,
It is that easy.
you know, but anyway, that's all to say. So that entire year, I, pregnancy was like slowly me coming to, like, I had embraced the submission part, and then pregnancy was like embracing the womanhood part. And I was always really bothered
I think I lost you.
before when I would
Oh, you're back.
see like birth photos or birth stories. Like I would like aggressively like skip past it and like tell Instagram not to show me those things.
Oh,
you
wow.
know? And it was like so bothersome to me. And even after I got pregnant in my first trimester, like, sweetheart, are you getting tired? Anyway, there's a point to this. But so
It's okay.
I had him January 1st. And so I look back on like the timing of it all is just amazing, because December we started trying for a baby, and then that 2021 was like coming to grips with like God designed me to like give, like, create life and give birth, and then he was born January 1st.
Wow.
And it was just like this revival, and that's his middle name, is Revival. But anyway, so to answer your question, like what came out of it? Well, like life came out of it, and like also me embracing being a woman, like, and that was, I don't know if you've seen my slides that I did on femininity.
Those ones.
Those ones? What?
Those ones. Those slides that you wrote about femininity. Just those.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Well, it's a highlight now. It was just
Okay.
In it, I talk about like that, the word that comes to mind when I think of embracing your womanhood and your feminine roles in marriage and all that. The word is surrender. You just have to surrender. And so I'm still surrendering. It's not like I have completely surrendered everything. There's still times when I'm like, whoa, I still have a grip on this, Lord, and this is really hard to open my hands. But yeah, fostering that peace in my marriage and that submissive spirit, and like actually just loving my husband for the sake of loving him. And then, our child, and it really culminated in like giving birth. And that was just like, okay, like I'm surrendering. Like, God, you made me the way you made me. By the grace of God, I am who I am. And that was January 1st, which is just like crazy. He was due Christmas, born January 1st. So I hope that answered your question.
It did.
That was more info than...
No, that's perfect. That there's a phrase that stuck out for me, at peace with being a woman. And, there's a lot in there, say more about that, about being at peace with being a woman. It's absolutely beautiful.
Yeah. So I think that the best way to describe this is, when I was 13 or 14, my family went to, so it was me, and I have 4 siblings, but it was just me and my brother and my parents. We took a trip to Las Vegas, and I remember walking down the streets, and it's a very disgusting city. There's all these advertisements for prostitution, and like, it's like the perversion of everything good. And I remember we were walking down the streets, and I was 13 or 14, and I just broke down crying. And I said, I don't want to be a woman. I don't want to be a woman. And, or why did God make me a woman? It was intense. And like, just because being there just triggered something. And, I just started weeping. And, I had moments like that. I can remember that one very distinctly, but I remember having moments like that where, I would just start crying because I just didn't like the way God made me. And I think that ultimately manifested itself in my eating disorder. And like that was just like the physical manifestation of me striving and fighting my womanhood. Because I actually lost my period. I didn't have a period for 2 years when I was in my eating disorder.
Wow.
And so, I mean, that was the visible, or the, you know, the tangible manifestation of me striving and fighting, because, I wasn't even functioning like a woman hormonally. And so coming to grips with my womanhood has been, yes, mental and spiritual, but it's also been physical. You know, I started getting my period back when I started to like eat more and have more healthy relationships. And that was a physical manifestation of me being okay with being a woman. And so it's like, you know, we don't understand just how much the mind and the body and the spirit are all connected in this. And so I would say even when I started my page, there were still difficulties. Like, I would say I still hadn't really surrendered a lot of things. Sorry, he's moving there.
It's cute.
As long as he's happy.
Exactly.
But all this to say, when I started my page, I mean, I was still healing from a lot of these things. And so embracing being a woman has, one, embracing that God gave my body the ability to sustain life and to birth life. And that was something that when I was, you know, at war with myself, that could not have happened physically. I was not able to, right? Mm-hmm. And then also, like, babies come out of healthy marriages because couples are in love. Like, that's just the way it is. I mean, you know, obviously there's just as a general rule. And so it's like, I would say, like, my journey of embracing a woman has had so many of embracing being a woman has had so many physical manifestations of that. Like, and so, you know, like I always had short hair, like, for some reason. And then this, like,
I can't picture you with short hair.
And like, I just sorry.
It's okay.
Started growing my hair long. Right. Like, and, you know, and now, like, just eating in a very nourishing way. And like, it's just, I love this discussion because when we embrace who we are, if a woman is embracing who she is as a woman, it's not just a mental assent that she has, and then it clicks and she goes, yes, I like being a woman. Like, no, it manifests itself. Like, you know, and like wearing skirts and wearing dresses and just like being okay, like wearing girly clothes, like, oh, so many things. So, and it's funny because those are like the stereotypical, like, you know,
trad life.
Femininity. Yeah. Like, femininity isn't wearing skirts and dresses. And I'm like, yes, I recognized that femininity was innate to me. It was my birthright as a woman. I simply had to surrender to it. Mm. And then I started doing the things that were more stereotypically feminine.
Yes.
Funny how that works. Because, you know, people will, you know, well, you're portraying femininity as like this cookie cutter thing. And I'm like, oh, trust me, it's anything but cookie cutter. But, where did that go? Okay. But when I embraced it, sorry.
It's okay. Kid life.
You know, I've been thinking about time travel again.
Oh, no.
Need a roadblock with invisibility? Burner. It occurs to me.
Okay.
If I ever did perfect a time...
Okay.
It's okay. You got a baby there.
No, it was Big Bang Theory from what we were watching last night.
Oh, wow.
You were so silly. You were so silly. Okay.
Perfect.
So, what were we talking about before we got totally derailed?
We talk about surrendering to femininity. The femininity is not the outward performance, but an inward state of being.
I just love that this is the most chaotic.
It's so good. It's so good.
so it's not the outward performance, but when I embraced it internally, then I was free to like wear the skirts and grow my hair long. Like, because yeah, why not? Like,
right. It's fun.
It's fun. And
I've
it's
heard.
Fun it's fun to be different than my husband. Like, it's fun for him to have a beard and short hair, and for me to have long hair and wear skirts. Like, it's just fun, and it's just it's enjoyable, and it comes out of the internal peace and the internal surrendering.
Yeah, that's how, and I think that's where these discussions, they tend to get so low resolution. It's like, yeah, you're not just going to grow your hair long and put a skirt and go, walking in a sundress through a field, and congratulations, you're feminine. It's like, well, that makes for a nice Instagram post, but like, are you really embodying it? And when you said at peace with being a woman and surrendering to femininity, like, it's one thing to act the act, right? But it's another thing to really make peace with yourself, make peace with God, make peace with men, make peace with your husband, and be a part of that, and then see what comes out of that rather than adopting the uniform, right?
And even like most people would say, yeah, I don't have a stereotypical like feminine way of expressing myself. But it's like, it's so interesting to me that if a man thinks he's a woman, he puts on the uniform and everyone affirms him.
That's funny.
Right? And the woman that wears like cargo pants and a t-shirt and doesn't brush her hair will still look like a woman in a way that he cannot ever. But at the same time, like, I think it kind of goes both ways, because I surrendered and then I started to embody a more feminine appearance, but I also started to embody a more feminine appearance before I completely surrendered. And so like, it was both, because there was a sense in which I was like, I aspire to something that I'm not internally aligned up with just yet, but because I want to get there, I will in advance just start. I don't know how to explain that. Like, it's still coming from a desire to be truly feminine. But yeah, we seek to embody the things that we look up to. And then we also, when we embody it, it flows out. So I guess I would say it's both. Yeah.
Well, it's like the saying, like, fake it until you make it. Right.
Yeah.
But like, a lot of people forget about the whole like making it part. Like, you're faking it in the way, like, they'll just fake it. You have to actually
just fake it.
Yeah, exactly. Well, a lot of people will just fake it, right? It's really easy. It's really easy to put on the sundress, or in men's case, to get like super fit, right? And then you post a bunch of stuff on Instagram. It's like, congratulations, I'm feminine. Congratulations, I'm masculine. And it's like, well, are you actually embracing these sort of biblical or Christian gender roles? Because biblical gender roles are not the same as Christian. If you want to put them down or whatever, that's totally fine, by the way.
Yeah, I might just carry on. We pause it for a second.
For sure.
Okay.
Cool.
Hopefully he goes to sleep.
That's fine.
Sorry
I mean,
about all the it's
nothing to apologize for, because it lends the whole thing character. Like, this is the point, right? This is the point about being a wife. This is the point about being a mother, about being feminine. Like, you're doing the thing. Like, it just all adds to it, right?
Okay. Well, I love that perspective. Thank you.
Yeah.
So yeah, we were saying something about, what was it? It was
faking it until you make it.
Oh, faking it until you make it, and wearing the sundress and whatever. I was going to say something about that. Man, what was it? You were saying something about biblical Christian gender roles.
Yeah, about how biblical gender roles are not the same as Christian gender roles, because there are a lot of guys on Twitter, especially, like, polygamy is biblical, bro. I'm like, it's biblical, but it's not Christian, dork.
Right. Oh yeah, no, the Twitter, some of the stuff I've seen, I was like, women aren't made in the image of God. And I'm like, I think this is just a troll account. Like, I don't think this is like, I think it's just trying to make people look bad who, anyway. Oh, so putting on a mask. Yeah. So I don't know where I was going with that,
That's
but
fine.
if you want to go to the next, yeah.
Yeah, no, it's totally fine. I mean, it's just a matter of like, I think a lot of people will mistake the outward performance for inner transformation. Like
Yes.
the distinction that I've heard is change and transformation are not the same thing. Change happens on the outside, transformation happens on the inside, but they play into each other, right? It's not just enough.
Right.
Like if you're not expressing your inner transformation outwardly, it might still be going on, but you can accelerate it by expressing it outwardly, right?
Yes.
And they feed into each other.
And that's what I was kind of getting at.
Mhm.
Yeah. Because I didn't want to wait until I felt feminine, or like, I didn't want to wait until it was easy, because some people will message me and they'll say, I want to wear more skirts and dresses, but I feel uncomfortable. And I think some people would say, well, then just don't wear more skirts and dresses until you feel comfortable in it. And I'm like, there's a reason you feel uncomfortable with it. But the good news is you can grow to feel less uncomfortable with it. You can grow to feel comfortable with it. Examine, like, maybe you just never had any role models that dressed feminine, and all the women in your life were very aggressive, A-type, dressed like business women or whatever. And so you just never had that soft, gentle, feminine way of dressing modeled for you. And so it's uncomfortable.
Right.
And you can sit with that discomfort, but I'm not going to wait until you feel like, you don't have to wait until you feel like you've elusively arrived. And so, like, I actually love the phrase "fake it till you make it," in the sense that, like, you're striving higher because you want to be higher.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah.
Would you be willing to talk a little bit about your eating disorder? Because I listened to that podcast and I was very, again, I feel very, very blessed by your bravery and your honesty in talking about these things, particularly because I think I saw someone mention this. It might have been Dear Sister, but mention women's accountability. That I did see it this past week, where it's like women have to learn what accountability is. It's really, really important because men can't take on all the accountability. So you saying, I was doing this, I was treating my husband this way, he didn't deserve it, I made these choices, like, that's accountability. And accountability transforms us. Accountability transforms us. So I appreciate you bringing these up, because I think it's a great model to be able to say for so many women who are very afraid of saying the simple words like, I'm sorry, I was wrong. Like,
yeah,
that's very difficult. But in saying that, it liberates. It totally liberates. And go ahead.
Yes. And so, do you want me to talk about my eating disorder in regards to that, or like, well, to go to what you were saying there, like with just being willing to say, I'm sorry, I was wrong. Like, humility is, it is, and I'll just give you a story. When I was growing up, my dad, like, when sometimes he would get too angry or he would yell at us or whatever, he would come later that night and, like, knock on our doors and be like, I'm sorry, I spoke wrongly to you. Like, I'm sorry, I spoke unkindly to you. Will you forgive me? And, of course we did. And so I always had that modeled for me growing up, that, like, humility was strength. Mm. And so I see that too with accountability of, like, there is no weakness in just saying, I have messed up. But that comes from, like, my knowledge of being forgiven in the gospel. Like, that's not an isolated thing. And so I think when people are like, you expect me to, like, own my mistakes, they haven't been forgiven of their mistakes. So how are they going to own them? But, like, I have been forgiven of the way that I've treated my husband. I continue to be forgiven when I do not treat him well. And so I'm free to come on here and say, I have messed up, because I'm not attaching it to, like, who I am or my identity. And, it's like Charles Spurgeon has this quote, if any man thinks ill of you, don't be offended, because you're far worse than he thinks you are. And
I love that quote.
I love it so much. And that was liberating for me too, because when people would come and be like, you've said this thing in a very unkind manner. And I'm like, oh yeah, I probably did. Like, it's really okay. To just, to talk about these things. And obviously vulnerability has, like, you have to be vulnerable in the right context, right? Because it is a strong and powerful thing in the right context. And then it's a dangerous thing in the wrong context.
Yes.
But, and so, I've probably overshared I've probably done that, but try to make my vulnerability beneficial to people, and not vulnerability for the sake of vulnerability, or for the sake of, I just want to feel known by strangers. It's like, okay, I have God, I have my husband, I have my family. And so my vulnerability there has to be a purpose here. So with the eating disorder, like, I think I started sharing about that. I'm not sure if my podcast was one of the first times I shared about that. But yeah, I've gotten some great messages about that. I mean, it's one of those things I think ties really well into the femininity sphere, because there's a lot of reasons people develop eating disorders, but a lot of women develop it around the time they're going through puberty and their bodies are changing. And it's like you're trying to turn back the clock because you don't want to advance. And
really,
and, I mean, a lot of women develop them earlier than that, and women also develop it later. But as I've been processing it, when I'm thinking about this here, it's like women start to develop that awareness of themselves. And so I think that this movement that we're seeing on social media, and, of women like learning like how to eat and properly nourish themselves and what is normal, not like fat positivity, but really just embracing your womanliness. Like, as I've been processing that, I'm like, yeah, like I couldn't accept that I was changing. So I tried to turn it back. Like,
wow.
And so I think it goes very well with the discussion of womanhood and femininity. Because yeah, if you're not eating well and you don't have a period and you can't carry life, you can't sustain life, you don't have energy to be, the person God calls you to be. So yeah, I developed that. I started developing it around, my first awareness of it was like 6th grade, which is very early.
Yeah.
And I started to just like participate in behaviors. Like I would just like go 2 days without hardly eating. And then I would like just eat a bunch and like go back to normal, but it was always like very sporadic. And then when I was 16, I started to like really start to like get hyper fixated on like my calories and my diet or whatever. And was like super restrictive. And like some days I was eating like 800, 900 calories a day.
Wow. Not very much.
Yeah. Like I was like, I don't know, like 15 pounds less than I am now, maybe. Which when you're 5'3" is kind of a lot.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, and then like I just remember it kept getting worse and worse and worse. And like, I remember this one time I went on a bike ride with my brother, and like, it's Arizona. It's not that cold in the winter, but we went on a bike ride, and I came back from that bike ride and I just like had no feeling in my extremities. And I just remember like sitting in the bath, trying to warm up, crying because my body couldn't regulate its temperature. So I had a few moments where I was like, okay, this is getting really, really bad. And they started talking about, doing more like concentrated, care. But I started to, it wasn't a long-lived eating disorder. Some women like struggle for years and years and years. I would say it was a concentrated year of like intense struggle. But when I started to heal, I was going to a new church. I had started making new friends. This was around the time I met my husband. And like I had left a very academically rigorous school and was attending, like I was just finishing high school at a very easy school just so I could focus on healing. And so I just started rewiring my brain. Like, you are not treating yourself well. You need to eat now. And I would just tell myself over and over and over again, like the things that I needed to do until I believed it. And I would say what really changed things was my friend and I started reading through Revelation, of all books. And like talking about like Jesus coming back on a white horse and the blood is like up to the horse's bridle. And I'm reading all this and I'm like, I was like trying to reconcile my eating disorder with like God's eternal purpose of glorification and like restoring all things. And I was like, just thinking about it, I was like, I'm wasting a lot of time on this in light of eternity. And so that was when that was like one of the really, integral parts of my recovery. So anyway, when I started healing, I still hadn't gotten my period back, and I got it back. That was a pinnacle moment in my life because, and do you mind if I share the story?
Please go ahead.
Okay. So, because this goes into, embracing womanhood and all that, but so I was recovering, I was eating more, I was, in a healthier mental space, but I still hadn't got my period back. So I was like trying to get help from like doctors and stuff, but the allopathic world wasn't being super helpful.
What?
Shocking?
Really? I'm offended.
Yeah. So anyway, I saw a naturopath who like figured out everything in like 20 minutes of talking to me and actually hearing my story. But
Go figure.
Anyway, I was dating a guy at the time that I didn't end up marrying.
Mm-hmm.
So I went up to northern Arizona to visit a friend, and I was staying with a friend, and I remember expressing my concerns because I was dating this guy at the time. And so for the first time in my life, I was thinking, oh, maybe I'd like to have children one day. Novel thought, because I hadn't thought really about that.
It's not really on your mind at that age.
Yeah. Well, I mean, a lot of women at 15, 16 are thinking about growing up and having families. I was not. I was completely disconnected from that. And so having a period, I also didn't have like the necessary hormones to even be thinking about that. But anyway, okay. I was dating this guy. And so I was like, oh, I would like to have a family one day. So I'm kind of concerned that I don't have a period because that I can't have children. She was like, well, let's just like pray about it. And so that night I just felt randomly like, oh, I should listen to 1 Samuel. I had no idea what was in 1 Samuel. Okay. I just was like, I'm just randomly going to listen to it. And she was like, why don't we listen to 1 Samuel? And I was like, oh, you're thinking the same thing? Like, it was very random.
Or not random at all.
Not random at all. In the beginning of 1 Samuel, it's Hannah crying out to the Lord for a son.
Mm-hmm.
And she cries out to the Lord for the son, and God blesses her womb and gives her a son. So I fell asleep that night listening to that. And I just I was like, Lord, if it'd be your will someday to have, like, I'd like to have children. I woke up the next morning, had breakfast, got my period for the first time in 2 years.
Score.
So, and that morning, I just had this mental image of my husband, my current husband, and sons. And that was like something I've clung on to for years, because it was like, okay, Lord, like, I don't know if this is like gonna happen, but this is just, there's just this pinnacle moment of, I got my period back, and I just had this image in my mind of this family. I saw this family, and it had been completely regular ever since, no problems whatsoever. And so I love my eating disorder story, because it's also my womanhood story. It's also my motherhood story. It's also my falling in love with my husband story. And it's just all so intertwined. And so, yeah, that's, and I'd like to do a more in-depth podcast, really hashing that out for people. Because I've had people say, like, talk more about motherhood. You're like, you don't really talk about motherhood. And I'm like, it's still such a vulnerable thing. Like, it's still so intense for me. Because it's a story of the way I mistreated myself for years. It's the story of how I disconnected from myself. It's the story of how I didn't want children, and God completely changed my heart. And to see where I'm at now with this beautiful son, it's like, what? Because going down the trajectory I was going, I probably would have just ended up like just, extremely malnourished. Like, I mean, it was terrible. It was terrible. So, and here I am. So
Wow. I mean, what strikes me about that is, I think you had said that you were rebelling. I didn't know that about women's eating disorders, that they come on at puberty as a rejection of womanhood. I never would have put.
I literally just thought about that. So
Cool.
don't
Okay, so don't go run out there and make a whole thing out of it.
Yes. So don't run out there and make a whole thing about it. But I remember, it was like, I know that sometimes women who have been sexually violated will develop binge eating disorder and become overweight as like a mechanism.
Yeah.
And so obviously these traumas can affect that. And so I'm just sort of thinking or like talking about it as it comes to mind, because it was that awareness of me changing and becoming a woman that brought about the thoughts of like, this isn't good. Because when from age, 10 to 16 or whatever, like you're gaining so much weight at a time because your body's getting ready to maybe support a life someday. There's so much going on. And if you're not properly educated, nobody really talked to me that much about it. And so it was like, oh, I need to stop this. Like this, this isn't good,
Mm-hmm.
And I think that could be the reason that there are, so many infertile couples. I say that sensitively. And, but it's just like, yeah, we weren't taught to treat ourselves as women. We were taught to, trying to stay in girlhood and not move on to womanhood. And then what better way to do that than to basically starve yourself? I don't know.
Makes a lot of sense.
It makes sense to me. So, yeah.
Well, men have this thing. Well, it shows up in both men and women, but I lived in San Francisco and was where I first heard the term. It's like Peter Pan syndrome. Like a little boy, like a young adult human male, right, can construct his life in such a way as to never get married, never have kids, and men and women can get married and do that dual income, no kids kind of lifestyle. And it's this Peter Pan syndrome. Like, I don't want to give up some form of extended adolescence to actually step into the responsibilities of motherhood and fatherhood. And, and that makes a lot of sense that there would be like a deep psychological rebellion, spiritual rebellion that would even manifest in, if only in you, but I would be surprised if you're alone in this, in depriving your body of the nutrients it needs to be able to take that step as a way of kneecapping yourself, from that maturation process and being able to, and completely hiding what it's about. You know what I mean? Like no one would ever say, oh, she has an eating disorder. It's like, it's not about rejecting motherhood. No one would ever think that. It's like it's like a perfect way of going about it almost. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And I think too, like it's hiding signs of femininity. Like, and you see that with all the androgynous clothing that's like a box, like can't let anyone know that I'm a woman or can't let anyone know that you're a man. Like obviously within modesty. But there's like this, I'm going to check on my son real quick.
Sure.
Thank you.
Uh-huh.
Okay. He put himself to sleep, which is great.
Oh, good.
But yeah, no, there's these, I was listening to this podcast and they were just talking about these androgynous styles. And it's like, they managed to be, what they were saying that I found was interesting. They managed to be like sensual and immodest while still being androgynous. And it was like, only like this degenerate, corrupt world can come up with this kind of stuff. Like,
did they say that like it was a compliment or did they say it was a criticism?
That, like, they were like it's a criticism of like, of just like the absurdity of the way it's like the clothing that's designed for women now is it designed to like be androgynous and like almost masculine, but still like sensual and immodest. It's like, I don't know how they come up with this. Anyway, I just thought about that.
Evil geniuses,
right? So anyway, yeah, it's so interesting to me. I'm like, I don't know why I had such a hard time embracing my womanhood or whatever. And I've talked to people with a variety of experiences. And it's interesting to me just how many people have struggled with it because I'm like, where does this come from? I had a very healthy family. I had, a feminine mother who raised 5 children and was a stay-at-home mom for many years. Like, where do these ideas come from? And yeah, I would love to talk more about it because I think it could make people feel less alone, where they're like, I know God made me this way, but I am struggling to surrender to it.
That's very helpful for me because I come from a background, like before I was Christian, I was very much into psychology and inner transformation and inner healing, which I still think has a lot of value to it. And I was talking to the friends who baptized me because I've been trying to understand the intersection between Christianity and, we'll say, humanistic psychology. Where do they overlap and where do they differ? Mm-hmm. Because I know they do differ. And what my friends told me is that they said the humanistic psychology world says that life writes on us, right? And we have to undo the writing of life onto us, trauma, childhood trauma, stuff like that. But they said that in Christianity, your sin nature writes on life and it goes the other way. And so that really got me. It took me a while to understand. Barb, who told me this, she was one of the women who baptized me, introduced me to Christ as well. Took me a while to understand that, but the more that I thought about it, we're talking about the curse in the garden, right? And all that stuff. That's sort of what the essence of it is that there might not be anything in your past that you could identify as like having quote unquote caused that, right? But it just kind of came out of you naturally as part of maybe your own unique sin nature that you had to overcome that can't be tied to anything. It's no one's quote unquote fault. It's just, It's part of you that surfaced and that needed to die on the cross and be redeemed.
Yes. And I think because there's a segment of, there's just this whole sphere of thought that is obsessed with unpacking traumas.
Yeah.
And digging deep and just continually digging and digging and digging. And in some ways, it's almost like a deflection from actually having to just come face to face with yourself and be like, I'm the problem. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, and I know Brendan Schmidt has sent some really, is it Schmidt or anyway?
Schmidt, Masculine Revival.
Yes, but he said some really good things about introspection and this unhealthy navel gazing. Yeah. I think he called it. So yeah. And so I look at myself as like the perfect example of that. Yes, obviously there were things in my life, in my childhood. Everyone has things, right? But a lot of it's just sin nature internally, and God gave me this story and he's redeeming it. So.
Mm-hmm. And that's the beautiful part about it is that, you've gone through these significantly challenging events, whether it be your eating disorder, whether your own experience of your own, we'll say unattributable bitterness, that, rather than suppressing them, right, denying they didn't happen, or rather than celebrating them, like shout your abortion, not that you had an abortion, but that's a whole thing, where it's like celebrate your bitterness towards men. You get them, girl, cut them off at the knees or whatever. Rather than celebrating these things, you sacrifice them at the altar. You died to self and now you don't have any attachment to it anymore. So you can express it in this really clear way that I know for a fact, without actually knowing for a fact, but I know for a fact that women need to hear. Because there's so few voices like yours willing to talk about eating disorders. Like eating disorders are like, most people turn it into a medical problem rather than a spiritual problem. Yes. Right? Or bitterness is a social problem, not a spiritual problem. But you've identified the source of these within yourself and you put it out there for people to consider. Yeah. Yeah. So as you've gone on this content creation journey, and as you've discovered that your experiences are shared with women across the generations, older and presumably younger for you, like what's been your favorite part of this?
Oh yeah, I look back on the earlier days of my page as being my favorite days.
Sure.
And it was sort of like sub 10,000 followers, but the followers were very engaged. And so I had more bandwidth for individual people. And like I would do these lives where we just talk. And I look back on that so fondly. I think it's the connection with people, obviously, that is the best part. But what I've noticed, and it's like, we're all going through the same basic things.
Mm.
And people are looking for someone to articulate it for them and to give a name to it and to say, yes, that is what I'm going through. And so to be able to provide that for people, I love that. Like, to be able to like say, let's talk about bitterness. And women are going, I've had this attitude towards my husband, and you're right. That's what it is. And like and you can just say it for what it is. And to see that light bulb moment, it just brings me so much joy. And to have the messages coming in from women saying, since following your page, my marriage is so much better. My husband and I are so much happier. And like also to see women taking responsibility for themselves, even if their husbands aren't, and to realize that this movement isn't about trying to make your husband different. It is about you working on yourself. And so those are just wonderful messages, that I receive regularly from women. Yeah.
Can we talk about that what you just mentioned about, because I get a lot of messages from women, how do I get my husband to step up, right? It's a whole subject of conversation. And it's a very complicated question with no single silver bullet answer. I have some ideas, but I'm curious because it sounds like you speak from a position of authority to women that I don't know that I could necessarily claim. Like a woman writes to me and says, why won't my husband step up? Well, my expertise is in men. So I'm going to give her, I'm going to take her at face value, right? Which I shouldn't always do, but I do it anyway. Take her at face value and say that, okay, let's just assume that you're telling the truth and he's the only problem. Probably not, but still. How to speak to men to call forth the best in them versus like, I don't know that I could as authoritatively say, well, maybe you need to work on yourself first. That'd be right. But that's why the Renaissance of men and the Renaissance women exist, because we're tackling two halves of the problem with their own individual expertise from our own experiences. So if you could say some of the answers that you give to some of these women, because that was very powerful for me to hear. It's like part of it is like, you have to work on yourself and don't worry so much about him in some ways.
Yeah. And that's like, people will message me looking for the magic pill.
Right.
They want me to say something that's going to make all the stars align and just click. And I see it all the time, and I recognize it because I used to do that of like, I remember like being in a hard place and I reached out to like the transformed wife and I was like, she's going to have the answer. Before I started my page. But,
she's awesome, by the way.
Yeah. So I recognize that when people are reaching out and they're like, please give me the answer. And something I like to say is like, I just present this universal truth, which is you can't change anybody else.
Yeah.
And that truth can either make you so mad and just frustrate you to no end and put you on this spinning hamster wheel. You can do that with that, or you can work on focusing on yourself. And I think it is a merciful and loving thing to tell people that, because if they're still thinking, I can change my husband, like they're going to be very, very frustrated. And I see this, and I wanted to articulate this in a post of like, when you come across marriage advice that is, in order to work, it requires that you change your husband or change his behavior, run from it. Mm-hmm. Because it's not offering you anything sustainable, and it's not offering you something that is, it's just going to drive you deeper and deeper into frustration. So that's the first thing is like, just asking them, like, I mean, just showing them, can you change anyone else? Like, can you change another person? Can you change your boss? Can you change? Why do you think you can change your husband? Now, show them that, and then show them the beautiful thing, which is as it says in 1 Peter 3, your pure and respectful conduct may win your husband without a word. And so, and that's what it says in 1 Peter 3 is like, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives. Right. Mm. And I'm like, this is the key right here in this text. You can't, if your husband's being disobedient to the word, or maybe he's just not being the husband you want him to be. Okay. We don't, maybe he's just down and out.
Well, how could he possibly be? How could a man ever possibly be 100% of what a woman wants? Like, that's just
exactly right. And yeah. So, I bring them to that verse, and because a lot of times, speaking from experience, if I want to change something about my husband, I try to talk his ear off into changing. Which is silly, right?
That's not going to work.
And so it's so interesting to me that Peter literally says they may be won without a word. It's like, you don't need your many words, and you don't need your convincing arguments, and you don't need your I'm smarter than you and you should listen to me spiels. Like,
wow. Not going to work. You wouldn't want it to either.
And like, I have noticed when I get into that place where I'm like trying to verbally assert why he should change or whatever, like I'm becoming just an unpleasant, aggressive person to be around. It's just like it's a zero-sum game.
Yeah.
So showing them that they may be won without a word by their pure and respectful conduct. So start there. Like, then try that out for a while. Then come back and truly, if by your conduct you are being respectful and loving and kind and just living in harmony, like seeking to live in peace with your husband as far as it depends on you, then come back to me. Because this is the other thing too, is like, so many women will reach out wanting the magic pill, and I'm like, do you have a local church? And like are you involved in these conversations don't happen in a vacuum. And so people will reach out, and I'm like, sounds like neither you or your husband have any sort of community or accountability. Like, that's your first problem. And so I can give you some verses that apply, but the problem is greater than he won't help you with, etc. Like, whatever. So yeah, I think there is also room for, looking at it case by case, because sometimes someone will come to me and they're like, I'm just tired. Like, I do the dishes every night. And it's like, well, find a way to be joyful doing the dishes. Like, it's really okay.
Based.
That's different than, someone coming to me and going, my husband has this alcohol addiction. And that's where I'm going to go, right. Are you involved in a local church? Like, do you have accountability? Are there people like, because I'm on the other side of the world behind a screen. Yeah. I can't do anything for you here. So anyway, case by case basis, and really, really pointing out that behavior thing, because, and the way that you can make it make sense to women is to just say, let's say that, like, maybe they have an angry husband. And let's say all of a sudden he stopped speaking in this harsh, aggressive, angry way and became very tender and loving. Would that change you? Well, of course it would. Like, maybe.
Oh yeah. I see.
You see what I'm saying? Of like, if you, yes, sometimes women are so embittered that their husband, and I'm not talking about the husband being the nice guy all of a sudden. That's not what I'm referring to.
Right, yeah. A decent guy.
Yeah. If there's a serious anger problem or whatever, and, this man repents of it and he starts treating his wife in this loving, still firm, but loving and tender way, that is going to impact her. And so why don't we think the same will happen? Like, no, we don't change people, but we do respond to stimuli right? Does that make sense?
Yes.
And so, because of course your husband's going to react differently if you treat him with a loving, you speak to him lovingly and respectfully, and you actually smile at him and you're actually interested in hearing what he has to say. Of course that's going to make a difference versus ignoring him, quick, snarky responses, trying to assert yourself, blah, blah, blah. So that's my point, is like, just think about every other normal human interaction in your life. There's this, you sense how someone is treating you and you change your response and reaction to that. So why not in your marriage? Like, yeah, I hope that made sense.
It does. That's a great answer. I was, this conversation comes up in various forms at least once a week. And I was out, getting coffee with a friend of mine from church named Amber, shout out Amber. And we were having this very conversation about like, how do we quote unquote, trying to get men to change, and like just trying to unpack it. Cause I don't remember how it came up, but it was very much related because I'm having the conversation in other ways as well with guys during the week and stuff like that. And I think we had come to a similar conclusion that rather than stepping into the space and saying to your husband, you have to be like this and this and this, and lecturing and laying up like an accountability plan and all that, like that's just not going to work. That's not going to land for most men. And you wouldn't want to be with a man that it did land for, right?
Right.
You wouldn't respect him anyway. Oh, that sounds like a great plan, honey. I think I'll do that. It's like, what are you doing? You're not supposed to say yes to that, right?
Right.
But if you step out of the space and you create an environment that welcomes him to step into it, and as a woman, you're receptive, that calls forth the best in him that he may not necessarily have ever experienced before.
Yeah.
Right? Rather than coming in from over the top, or just like you're kind of, it's not even like a top down, bottom up kind of approach. It's like, I'm going to create the opportunity for you to step up and be the hero. And to experience that part of yourself that maybe you haven't had the chance to experience perhaps ever, but not for a while at least.
Yeah. And that's a great point, because I'll sometimes get messages from women saying, I know I'm supposed to submit, but like my husband isn't giving me anything to submit to. And I think there's also like personalities that are involved in this, like, and so I try to look at things from a case by case basis or whatever, but I sometimes just wonder, like, does he feel able to express those things to you that he actually wants? Or like, have you created an environment where he feels like it's okay to state those things without getting some ridiculous reaction? Or, it's like, and I think in some cases, yes, like there are, I've met people in my real life where the dynamic of the couple is just so different than what I'm familiar with. And I'm like, I don't understand this. But as a general rule, to go back to what you were saying, like there is a way to try to get what you want, but to shut down the possibility for what you actually want. I don't know if I'm making sense, but
I get it.
Women are trying to accomplish, they're trying to bring these things out of their men. But the way that they're going about it is the very thing that's shutting it down. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And so, yeah, how are you? And I always bring it back to 1 Peter 3, your conduct. That is such an interesting word, because conduct isn't just behavior. It's not just speech. It's speech. It's behavior. It's how you dress. It's how you smile. It's how you interact in the world. Conduct is a very holistic word. And so is your conduct bringing that out of your husband? Because I have fallen in the trap so many times wanting to bring something out of my husband, and I immediately go to talking, but my conduct isn't living up to it. Right. So
I think I could also speak for at least some men in seeing that, conduct is also your thoughts. Like, I think men are hyper visual, and we take in just an incredible amount of information with our eyes. And it's almost like in watching women, we can't read their mind, but we can read their mind through the changes in their face and their posture based on what they're thinking, right? And it's like, you may not say anything, you may not do anything, but a man's like, what's wrong? Right? So
yeah. And yeah, my husband does this to me all the time of like, I'll like cock my head differently, and it's like, what's going on? Like,
yes.
So, no, and to go back to thoughts too. I want to talk about that.
Yeah.
This is the other thing that I tell women is, how are you thinking about your husband?
Yeah.
Because you've just told me all these things he's doing wrong. Yeah. If you're dwelling on that all day, that is a recipe for only seeing the bad things. And so like, I remember when my husband and I were going through a hard time, he would drop me off at work, or I would take the car, whatever, how it worked out. And I would be stocking shelves in the morning, and it was like my morning bitterness rehashing stocking shelves time.
Oh, wow.
Like time to put candy on the shelf and think about how angry I am.
One bag, that bastard.
It's like, and it's like, I remember I had this clicking moment where I was like, you know what? I bet if I replaced these thoughts with scripture that I've memorized, my life would change. I don't know for sure, but I think maybe my life would change. And so there would be times I'd be stocking shelves and I would either start getting those adulterous thoughts or those bitter thoughts, and I would just be rehashing it in my mind. And then I would go, let's just go through 1 Peter. Let's just go through this. And I would actively replace that thought. And you can't be thinking about adultery while you're, blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who's blessed us with every, it's like,
yeah, I'm not going to work so well. Someone's going to win. That one of those thoughts is going to win.
One of those thoughts is going to win. And I mean, the hard part for women though, is getting to them. It's like, I can tell you, you need to replace those thoughts with scripture. You need to replace those thoughts with thinking loving thoughts about your husband. I can say that all day. But the hard part for women is really getting to the point where they actually want to get out of the bitter thoughts, because the bitter place is a comfortable stewing sort of place to be. And I realized that I was in that place for so long. I was addicted to that feeling of being angry, getting in my car after work, listening to moody music that was feeding that. Like I was just addicted to that experience. And so for me, it was like, I had all this scripture memorized. The discipline was to go from, in spite of how I feel, I am going to actively replace that thought. Mm-hmm. So that's what I would also tell women is, how are you thinking about your husband while he's at work? And are you like rage cleaning the house of like, he doesn't help out around the house at all, and I'm just so angry, and yeah, that's your conduct. And when he comes home, he's going to see a rage cleaned house and a rage cleaning wife. Like, versus, are you like praying for him and thinking loving thoughts about him and speaking to your children in a positive way about their father? And so when he comes home, that's what, you have children who love him and a wife who loves him. And that all goes back to your thoughts.
So I want to talk about this bitterness state of mind, because this is something that I've identified. Yeah, no, it's really important because I think of things, the states of mind that are opposed to Christ and the gospel as power, right? Everything is conceived in terms of power, right? So men who reject the gospel are men who reject submission to Christ because they want to be their own little gods. God is dead, so I'm going to be my own little god because I can be powerful. Now, women don't have the ability to be physically powerful in the same way that men do, but I think of women can become their own little gods maybe because of that feeling of bitterness, because it gives them power over their environment. Does that map?
So you went blank for a second.
Oh, sorry.
You said women don't have the ability to be physically powerful as men do, and then I lost you.
But okay, so women don't have the ability to be physically powerful like men do, but women can step into that space of bitterness because it gives them power over their environment.
Yeah.
Do those two map together?
Right. Yeah. Well, and you can do things that you think are having power over your husband. So withholding sex, withholding affection, the silent treatment, this kind of stuff is like the woman's version of trying to have power and over her husband. And that all stems from the root of bitterness. Like Hebrews talks about bitterness as a root, the root of bitterness. See to it that no root of bitterness springs up among you, and by it many become defiled. So, and then it says also in 1 Peter 3, let all bitterness and hypocrisy and malice and envy and slander be put away from you. And to go back to the idea of bitterness being a root, it's a root because all these branches and leaves and things stem out of it. A bad fruit. It bears horrible fruit. But the root is that seething, bitter heart. And it can be, and a lot of the other words we use for that, unforgiveness is one of them. Mm-hmm. I'm harboring unforgiveness for something that your husband said, or harboring bitterness towards your husband because you resent that he has a different role than you, that he is different, that God made him different, and you resent that, right? And for me, it was bitterness of resenting things that I perceive to be like, oh, I'd want you to do this differently or whatever, but resenting that one fleshness that means that you do not have that bodily autonomy that is so valued in our culture. Right. Mm-hmm. So and that's, I mean, it's a hard thing to come to grips with when you're 20 and newly married and
yeah. You got the full dose, right? Like
I did.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Well, and I always believed in Christian gender roles. I always believed in, I'm going to get married. I'm going to submit to my husband. Like, of course I'm going to submit to my husband. And that wasn't like something I had to learn to believe. I always believed that. But it's amazing how the justifications, when you're in that place of bitterness, how the justifications for submission will start. You'll start making excuses, and you basically take the word submission and you whittle it down to this meaningless nothing word. And I see that all the time is, yes, I believe in submission, except in but. And I'm like, so you don't believe in submission. Mm-hmm. You've taken the word and you've completely destroyed it of what makes it submission. It's basically when I agree. And so, but I noticed that tendency in myself of, where does it talk about people accumulating counselors for themselves for their itching ears?
I don't know.
I think it's in one of the epistles, but it talks about in the latter days, or they'll accumulate teachers for themselves. And I noticed that with myself, is that I was accumulating people that would tell me what I wanted to hear, and would tell me, would justify my bitterness and say, yeah, it kind of makes sense that you're feeling that way. I would feel that way too, and blah, 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 blah. And it wasn't until I talked to this one person, they just said, submit to your husband. And I was like, and they didn't define submission for me. They knew that I knew what submission was. I didn't need someone to define it. And they just said, submit to your husband. It's like, oh, that's all you're going to tell me. So yeah, no, bitterness is, it is the spawn of many evil things. Mm-hmm. It's a poison is the best word to describe it.
Yeah, I'm pretty rigorous, with keeping bitterness away from me when I detect it. It's something that I've always had a visceral reaction to, in part because it's not my character to be bitter at all, and in part for that very reason that it is a root. And I think what's interesting about what you said is that the way we're used to thinking about things related specifically to women's bitterness towards men is that women would be these perfect, flawless creatures if only men in patriarchy hadn't abused them into bitterness, right? Right? It's like, oh, I can point to all these things from my past in the world that legitimize bitterness. And it's kind of got the causality backwards. The causality is like bitterness is this root that lives within all of us, but in a specific way of women towards men. And so it reaches out looking for reasons to justify itself, but it has no justification.
It looks for reasons to justify itself. And that is what makes an enemy out of men.
Yes.
And makes an enemy out of your own husband. I wrote some post about this, and I can't remember it now, but it's once you start, this is why people like Christiana talk so much about who you surround yourself with. And are they encouraging you to speak well and think well of your husband?
Mm-hmm.
Because if they're not, you are treading in very dangerous waters by being with them. And so, to go back to this idea of women being, perfectly flawless if men hadn't messed it up, that is a framework and a lens for viewing the world.
Yep.
And so when you're talking to someone that's in that feministic mindset, they literally have these glasses on that see women as perfect beings, if not for men. It's a filter through which you view the world. And if you bring that into your marriage, then you are not accountable for anything you do. If you bring that into your marriage, like I am just a victim by virtue of being a woman, then any little comment your husband says, that isn't just living up to your perfect standards, any little thing is going to perpetuate that victim mentality that you have. And then you go out into the world and they're affirming that. And then you go online and they're affirming that. Like, do you see what women are up against when they just try to love their husbands?
Yeah. Yeah.
The world, the flesh, and the devil. I mean, those are our three enemies. And there's attacks on marriage on every single side. And to go back to what we were saying earlier, the women get into that space. So they're treating their husband like an enemy. He shuts down. And, this is why people say, oh, I feel like I'm married to a stranger. Like,
mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, what's so striking about that is the bitterness might not be there at all when they're courting, when they're dating, or even right up until they get married. And then they get married. They go through the ceremony of getting married, and then the bitterness shows up out of nowhere.
Yes.
That's legitimately frightening. That you can, as a man, I could get to know, the woman I'm dating or whatever, and everything is perfect and lovely. And then once the bond of marriage once the commitment of marriage is made, that bitterness will surface out of nowhere. It's like, who is this woman that I married? And suddenly it's not, and in the secular world, it's not her fault. It's my fault because I've now become the embodiment of everything that's wrong with the world. When like literally a week ago, that wasn't true. I was everything that was right about the world as her husband. Now I'm everything that's wrong about the world. How awful.
Yes.
Oh,
it hurts me to talk about because I did that.
Oh, I don't mean that as an accusation of you, by the way.
No, I know. And I'm saying you're right. You're right. It is so awful. And it's like, the same goes too for like, before marriage and the desire to fornicate is so strong. And then after you get married, it's like, whatever, right. It's just like, that's the attitude that is presented though. When I'm like scrolling through reels or whatever, and it's like this joke of like, like, oh, now I got married and I don't, I walk around in sweatpants and a mom bun all the time. And like, I'm not interested in having sex with my husband. And like, it's just this kind of stuff. And it's like, contrast that to like, we've glamorized this dating period, right? In the dating period, it's like, because the world has played house, they don't have this beautiful, robust, like, view of marriage being a distinct category from dating. They kind of blur the lines and stuff like this. And so it gets confusing. And like, even though my husband and I waited till we were married to consummate, but I noticed that too, of just like when you're dating, there's not that commitment there that makes you feel stuck, so to speak. And so you're like, I can be loving and I can be kind, because I don't really have to be like, but then you're married and you're like, oh, now it's like, I have this duty. And then suddenly it becomes like odious to you. And then there's that, like, I don't know what the name for this phenomenon is, but like when you realize you can't get out, then you want to get out kind of thing. It happens in marriages between people that are absolutely in love. Like it's really not about them as a couple. It's just this overarching principle of,
I'm feeling the pain of all of this, because one of the things that men talk about in our spaces is wives, withholding sex and what that does to a relationship. And you're absolutely right. Like you mentioned, like on the Instagram reels, like now I walk around in sweatpants and a mom bun. But I bet if you were to swipe back to her reels before she got married, she's doing all the TikTok dances and the pants and everything like that. Perfectly happy. You know what I mean? And, she got the man through, he approached her through Instagram saying, then they're married. And then she's like, okay, cool. Bye. Check out. And it's one of the phenomenon that men talk about, and a lot of men get very bitter and they get very angry about it, like in the quote unquote red pill world. And they try all these different secular answers to it, right? And the secular answers only go so far, right? As they do, right? Though they seem to
seeds of wisdom.
Yeah, they address the surface issue, but this bitterness that expresses itself in the desire to control men, regardless of how great the man is, and the woman needing to keep that in check, that because it will come out of her, and that bitterness showing up, and I'm just going to deprive my husband sex because I get to, and I don't need it as much anymore. And I have all these different excuses for why I don't want to. And so I'm going to control him by denying my husband, the man I profess to love, the one thing that makes him feel more connected to me than anything. Like it kills men.
And this is why when a woman in their sphere talks about not depriving your husband of sex or not withholding, they get so much hate.
Yep.
They get so many people coming against them.
Yep.
It's amazing to me. Just no, it's heavy stuff. It's really, really heavy stuff. And you can put it in terms that women will understand, like, well, imagine if suddenly your husband just you went in for a hug and he just wouldn't hug you, or, you try to put it in terms that women understand. But there is so much deprogramming. It's wild.
I'm glad you mentioned it, because I want to bring up some of the hate, because, my particular character is like, when I can identify a demon and put my finger on it, I like to inflame it a little more. You know what I mean? But I think this hate is like, this is a real thing. And we were getting closer to it. But I know that this point, that when you say something like, don't deprive your husband of sex, make him a sandwich, treat him with kindness, that women get really upset. They get really, really irrationally upset. And I guess I want to talk about that point, and then also like talk about what it's been like receiving that as well, because I know that a lot of people come into this content creation space talking about things that they think are self-evident and obvious and loving and promoting of harmony between men and women that are objectively positive. And the anger and the hatred and the vitriol that they get back for doing it is really shocking to a lot of people.
It is. And it's especially shocking because if you were to reverse it, I saw this reel of this man. He loves to cook and he makes beautiful meals for his wife. Okay. If he loves to cook, amazing. There was no message behind it. It was just this nice reel or whatever. But like, that's the kind of stuff that like nobody bats an eyelash at, or they're like, yes, like whatever. and then you like maybe even just kind of suggest maybe do something nice for your husband.
Yeah.
And it's like everyone flips out. And so the double standard, which has been pointed out a lot, but needs to continue to be pointed out so people actually see it. But I think too, it's like, again, if you're entering marriage and you have the feminist lens on, you have these feminist glasses on, then like, and feminism is Marxist. So you have an oppressor class and you have an oppressed class. Women are the oppressed class, men are the oppressors. And so if you're entering marriage with those lens on, then like this becomes like, and like I said earlier, feminism being the philosophical manifestation of the flaw, or the philosophical manifestation of the fall. But when you are entering marriage with that lens on, and that's why it's so triggering to people to see a woman just like loving her husband, because in their framework, it's like, it's, I don't know. I'm trying to think of an analogy that like does this justice for what they're seeing. They're infusing a situation. They're infusing something into that scenario that's not actually there. Right. So like, it's kind of like, I'm trying to find a way to articulate this well, but yeah, I'll just leave it at that, of like, they're infusing this worldview into something that is so innocent and beautiful and pure. Yeah. A woman just making a sandwich for the man she loves.
Yeah.
But it turns it on its head and it just twists it and warps it. And they see it through this Marxist oppressed worldview. And it's like, what? Because if you were to do it the other way around, then that fits their idea of how the world should be working. You know, the one who was, you know, the power dynamics have shifted. That fits their idea of what is good. That fits their moral standard. So it's important to remember that like the world has a moral code. It's all flawed and skewed and everything, but progressivism has its righteous laws and its unrighteous laws. And so simple things like saying, honor your husband, that is an unrighteous law in their worldview.
Yes. And this is the point that I've been making. I've made it on Twitter. I think I shared it on Instagram, is that progressivism, leftism, Marxism, this is a religion. It's a religion. Like, and so pushing back on the level of culture, pushing back on the level of politics, yes, by all means, we should do that. But if you're not pushing back on the level of religion, that depth into the psyche and into the soul, you're not rooted deep enough to push back from. Absolutely.
Yeah.
People,
and
go ahead.
And so that's why you see people who they're kind of trying to speak into that world, but they don't recognize that it's a religion. So they're still granting a lot of its assumptions and they're playing that halfway game. They're not going to really reach those. You can't. I was listening to this thing. There's a pastor in Texas named Pastor Joel Webbin, but he has a good YouTube channel. But he was just talking about how Paul, the Apostle Paul, he would confront the religion of the day. Mm-hmm. He didn't just, it wasn't too political for him or whatever. He would confront the religion of the day.
Quote unquote, too political, so divisive.
So divisive. And if you recognize that progressivism, wokeism, COVIDism, whatever, it's a religion, then you have an obligation that when you are preaching the gospel, you're also confronting the religion of the day. Now, I'm not saying that I don't talk about vaccines. I don't talk about whatever. Other people do a much better job of that. What I'm entering into confronting the religion, the feminism part of that religion. Mm-hmm. That is the particular beast that I'm trying to fight. But to, this like veneer of piety of like pietism basically of like, I'm just going to, to not enter into it's like, then you're not going to reach these people.
Got it. That's what pietism. I've heard this word recently, pietism.
Yeah, so pietism, it actually came out of like a Lutheran movement, I think. But it was basically like, we don't, Jesus is Lord of our spiritual hearts, but like not really Lord of everything else. Like,
Got it.
I'm not giving the most kind, like, because I don't agree with it. But
it's okay.
It's basically just like, it's like focusing on inner piety to the detriment of like, we also have a war that needs to be fought, right? So it's like, I'm staying out of the war. I don't like that war terminology. Like, I'm just focusing on the inner life. And I'm like, yeah, you start with the inner life. Okay. But then you go out and you're like, okay, I'm ready to do battle in the way that you do battle. Anyway, yeah, no, it's been a recent concept for me as I've been, yeah.
No, this is fantastic, because I've encountered this, right? Like, I encountered this showing up in many different ways in my world with men, where it's like, I'm a hardened cultural warrior. Like, I've, traveled around, I've seen so many more than 30 countries around the world. I've been on my own spiritual journey. So I've seen and I've done and I've been, and I see what's happening now to America, and I've seen America from the outside, and I've seen the way the rest of the world lives, and I see what's happening to the United States now. And so it's unconscionable to me. And I feel personally as a man, and many men are very comfortable saying, we need to fight for Western values or American values or whatever they are, right? And they're cool with that. But as soon as you say, no, I'm going to start fighting for Western American values, and I'm going to start fighting for Christian values, you get a lot of men going, nah, bro, I don't know how I feel about that. It's like, well, this is, as a Christian man, this is how I'm called to fight. Right. Yeah. I'm like there's a big book about it. You should check it out sometime, but a lot of people really draw back from engaging culturally, like at the point of most conflict. Right. That's, yeah. And so to hear that, and then they hold themselves up as virtuous in doing that. Like, oh, I'll just keep the main thing. The main thing is the saying that I've heard. Right.
That's right. The main thing. And here's the thing about that thing. What I would say to someone is, good, you keep the main thing, but realize that for that person lost in their sin, the main thing is feminism.
Yeah.
So I need to extract their main thing, like, in order to preach Christ, in order to, like, yeah, no, I know it's kind of, people forget, Jesus said, go into all nations and preach the gospel and disciple the nations and baptize them, teaching them to obey everything that I've commanded you. Okay, so that part, teaching them to obey everything I've commanded you, that's why we're getting into the nitty gritty, and we're getting into the details, and we're talking about feminism, and we're talking about, wokeism and all this kind of stuff, because that's what we're fighting. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, absolutely.
So then, I'm curious, like, so you get a lot of hate from people, and it's probably pretty striking to you, and you've probably developed your own strategies to deal with it, probably ignoring it or whatever. But like, the first time, what was it like the first time that you encountered that? And I know you've been very generous with your time, so I just have a couple more questions, if that's okay.
No, my baby's sleeping, so this is like,
oh, perfect.
Yeah. So I would always get like dumb comments from like, she, her with no profile picture and like 2 followers. It's like, okay. And those are very easy to just be like, okay. It was when I started realizing that I was on these like Reddit threads or forums or whatever, and they were writing things about me. And those hit at that essential part of us that wants to be understood, right? And feels frustrated when we're misunderstood.
Oh, wow.
And so I was reading these things that were just grand collective misunderstandings about my life. And so that touched on the like, oh, well, now I've been misunderstood. So, and people were saying the wildest things. I mean, and, it was really specifically things with my husband and I. And they were saying some very strange stuff. And they were actually like so there was a lot of this kind of stuff. She's very smart, objectively, but she's so brainwashed. It bothers me so much. She would be so successful in another life, but she's so brainwashed. This kind of stuff. Or people saying like, she's with this greasy Bible nerd, and like, he doesn't let her wear makeup because if she wore makeup, then people would see how beautiful she was, and then she would find a different man who actually blah, blah, blah. Like this weird stuff.
That's very how anti-misogynist of them. Just if she put makeup on her face, everyone would see how beautiful she is. Like what? Thank you, Reddit.
It was so bizarre. Yeah. And then they were making threads about my husband.
Greasy Bible nerd.
Oh yeah. It was like, I was like,
rough.
Someone was like, she stays with this greasy Bible nerd, and basically saying, oh, it was bizarre. And you know, the funny thing about these threads is they'll take something really normal that everybody does and suddenly like turn it into this super weird abnormal thing. You know, it's just like I don't know. They like, I remember my husband and I did like a Q&A or something, and they were taking screenshots of the Q&A and like analyzing every little whatever and
body language.
Like, it was like, or my favorite was, oh, he has a Rasputin beard. That was my favorite. That was hilarious. It's just like, these people need to be writing novels. Like, they're just so funny. But yeah, so those got to me a little bit. And then there was some more, there's like the really surface level stuff of like, you know, just being like, oh, she's brainwashed or whatever. And then sometimes I'm trying to think of a good example of this. But you know, when like people will try to intellectualize their very unchristian worldview, but like
never heard of it. What are you talking about? No way.
Like, there's normal like just being mean, and then there's just like this false pity, like, and yes. Yeah, and that kind of stuff was. So I would say the way that one is I set disciplines for myself of I'm just not going to Google myself. And I actually
told my husband,
I told my husband, I said, I need you to forbid me from Googling myself so that it becomes a submission issue if I Google myself. Therefore,
smart.
And he was
smart.
like, okay. He was like, you are forbidden. You are forbidden from Googling yourself. And I'm like, good. So now this is just like me being obedient to my husband. Like, this is.
Takes all the pressure off.
Takes all the pressure off. Like, I don't really want to, you know. So that's one of the boundaries too. And then also realizing like, oh, someone sent me this thing. It was like, you need a GIF for the people that are behind the screen when they're writing these things. And they sent me this, like, I'll have to send it to you. It's just so funny. Like, look at this when you see hate, because this is the person behind.
Oh yeah.
No, but actually realizing that it's real people. And
Probably.
The Reddit threads are real people because they have way too much information.
Okay.
And so the Reddit threads, realizing that it's real people, but it's like, I had someone anonymously message me, and I did an anonymous thing, and they said, I used to be one of those Reddit hate people. And I now follow your page and I see Christianity and biblical, like all this stuff. I can't remember exactly, but they professed. And then I think I've also heard someone else saying, I found your page through the Reddit hate threads, and realizing that even that is a way that people are like waking up.
Yes.
Because maybe they are just trashing fundies as they call them. I don't know, but they're trashing these people, and then, you know, something I say that's like thoughtful and kind and genuine ends up on that thread, and someone goes, that doesn't fit my perception of these people.
Yes.
I'm going to check out what she actually has to say. Maybe they DM me and they find that I'm actually very kind in responding to them. And then it starts to unravel because they realize that the community they were coming from was the hateful one, and the vicious, angry, bitter people. And I'm inviting them into this community of love and joy and peace. And I see it as even that can be used to reach people, because it has. And the other thing too is like, I don't know. I think sometimes people view, so there's this quote by Robert Frost where he says, it's something like the mark of education is to be able to listen to anything, almost anything, without losing your temper or your self-confidence. And
I like that.
I love it. And that's been this guiding rubric for me of like, I can listen and I can objectively, if I get an angry response in my DMs or someone is like, you're totally wrong about this and this is why, I can listen to that without losing my temper, and I can listen to it without losing my self-confidence. I can just see it for what it is. I don't need to make an example of it on my stories. Look, I'm getting all this hate. People hate me. Like, I can just see it for what it is. And that's been a helpful rubric. Because, you recognize this pushback is inevitable. And all I can control is how I respond to this. And sometimes it's worth my time because I know that there's someone behind the screen that really needs to be spoken to honestly and lovingly. And sometimes it's not worth my time and I let it go. So I would say I'm at a place now where I deal with the hate pretty well because I've just depersonalized it in many ways. Sometimes there will be an attack specifically on me or like attacking not just my ideas, but like I haven't really had attacks on my appearance, but things like that where it's like, it's not just your ideas they're going after, but they're really going after you as a person. And that can be hurtful for sure. But again, it's coming from people that don't even know my last name or like my favorite color. Like it's, why would I take that? Yeah.
Yeah. Why
Seriously.
would you take that? It's not actually about you. It's their projection of you, right?
And I'm not responsible for that.
Yeah.
And then I'll write a post and then I'll go, this is a good wake up call for me. Like I try to turn everything into, because I'll realize, wow, I was really deeply misunderstood and that hurts. Oh, you know what? I probably misunderstand others and that probably hurts them too. Like I just try to take it and turn it into an opportunity for a little bit of self-reflection and then just move on. Like everything can be a lesson if you make it that way. So doesn't mean it doesn't hurt sometimes, but I'm at a much better place with the unkind messages.
Can we talk a bit about this part in all of us that wants to be understood? Because I think it's really, I think it's a good part of us, but it's also very much inflamed by our social media age, which also like creates a lot of misunderstanding and then this downward spiral of trying to be understood, which in many ways creates only more misunderstanding.
Yes. So I think this also goes back to this idea of identity. And I look back at my life and I see someone who is constantly trying to find an identity to attach myself to. And then like, once I find that one thing, that's who I am. And so with the misunderstanding stuff, like we were not meant to be understood on a wide scale. We were meant to be understood by our God and by the people closest to us. And so when you have this pseudo people understand me online because they know some things about me, you're like, well, then I need to be fully understood. Like it's like a little bit panicking because you're like, how far do I go? And I am a believer in constructive vulnerability. And I've also experienced the joy of being able to talk about something from the heart and to have people understand it. And that's not a bad thing. But it's not like a race to be more understood, because I've noticed like in myself, sometimes I will be writing something and then I'll check myself and go, am I writing this to help others? Or am I writing this because I can't stand that someone has a misconception about me? Oh, I'm writing this because I feel compelled to correct a misconception. I'm going to be okay with that misconception because I'm known by God. I'm known by my husband. I'm known by my family. I'm going to move on. And you just have to be okay with being misunderstood. And like, I think when someone goes down the path of trying to be fully understood by the internet, then that's where their life is.
Mm-hmm.
That's where they spend their life, because those are the people that they're seeking understanding from. But yeah, I can understand if you don't have a relationship with Christ, if you don't have a good relationship with your husband or family or whatever, they're feeding something innately in you that just so desires and so longs to be seen for who you are.
That's really interesting, because I know
Maybe
that
it's a women thing. I don't know on the men's end how that is.
I mean, it's got to show up. I think it's a human thing.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I can identify it in myself, right? I get, I think maybe for men, it shows up differently because men in this space adopt a more combative kind of posture. So if someone doesn't understand, screw them, right? But I got to believe that it's part of being human to want to be understood, whether or not you express it. Like maybe for men, the opposite would be true, that they care so little about being understood that no one understands them at all. And that they get very isolated in that, versus women want to be overly understood.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And I think too, it's like, we all have a story and we all have a character arc in our lives.
Yeah.
And that like, I don't know how to like, the hero's journey, like,
Sure. It's a real thing.
So we all have that. And there have been like, one realization for me is like my character arc, my hero's journey, my story, whatever you want to call it, is 100% valid and wonderful, even if nobody knows the ins and outs of it. And it's between me and God. And also recognizing that, like, in eternity, as sons of God, we'll be recounting God's deeds for all eternity. And every person is going to stand as a trophy of God's grace and what he did in their life. So I believe that our stories are meant to be told eventually. I believe that our stories are meant to be shown in this glorious way of, look at what God has done for this sinner. And so I can wait, to be fully, I think these longings that we have, they really do point to something eternal. And sometimes people will go, you don't need to be understood. It really doesn't matter. And I'm like, actually, that longing points to something very deep and very eternal in us. It's just a matter of, I can wait a little longer until the revealing of the sons of God, right? So again, if you don't have that eternal mindset, then this life is all you have. Yeah, you better either just make peace with being misunderstood, or you better make sure everybody perfectly, completely understands you.
Not possible.
Not possible. And so then you will be very, very frustrated. So this is why people need really great friendships and a church.
Yeah.
And they need other people, because we weren't made to function alone.
No. And gosh, this is, I said earlier that the secular world offers so many different solutions that only go part of the way. And earlier today, in another circumstance, I was talking to someone else and recognizing, because I've been on my own journey recently to find the number of answers that really just come from Christianity. Like, that's just where the answers are. If you're looking for them in the secular world, you'll find like the junk food or the mass produced version of those answers, which are just good enough, but the real answers are in Christianity. So like that part about wanting to be understood, that even that, like with being eternally minded, that you will be fully understood and all misunderstandings cleared up and all slander. Yes. That all of that, like you will stand in the light and you will be vindicated as having done the right thing. Even if no one in this life ever understands that, in eternity, you will be understood, and you will have that feeling of, wow, it's just going to knock me over.
Yes. Yeah. It talks about our works being tested as by fire, and like the quality of our works being shown. It's like, we will be saved as through fire, but our works are going to be shown, whether they were built on a foundation of gold or hay or stubble or whatever. It's like, we have such a, so many people with the gospel, they've stopped at, I'm saved. Well, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
And that's all you need. But there is more. We're hesitant to talk about good works sometimes and all this kind of stuff, but there is a reason that we have this deep-seated longing. And I would say the majority of these frustrations that manifest themselves as longings can go back to something innately about us. I was talking about this, like, because, there's a lot of really interesting health information out there, and people are constantly on this. Oh,
sorry. Am I back?
You're back.
Okay. Sorry. I don't know what happened. It just said your computer is not allowing Riverside to record. Please refresh. So I'm like, all right, I don't know what's going to happen.
Okay, so it didn't lose. No, it didn't lose. Okay. So as I was saying is, so many people are on this healing journey of like constantly striving for better health, which it's good to try to be healthy, whatever. But it's pointing to the fact that we were made to have amazing glorified bodies with absolutely no illness, and probably be super fit and amazing and be able to like walk through walls and fly and stuff. Like, this doctrine of being glorified, eventually we see bits and pieces of it, of like, we're striving for that health. We're striving for that perfection. So when I see it, it's like, okay, let's pull that out and see how we can have a healthy participation in this, in the here and now.
There's a book that I read recently. C.S. Lewis wrote this trilogy of fiction works. They're commonly called the Space Trilogy. Yeah. So have you read it?
So I've read the first two, and I have yet to read the third.
Okay. So I was going to talk about the second book.
Yes.
So Paralandra. And by the way, Doug Wilson says we should call it the Ransom Trilogy, because C.S. Lewis was trying to get us to abandon the word space, because, as you know from the Out of the Silent Planet, that space is not space, it's the heavens, right?
Right.
But when I read Paralandra, and the absolutely, I don't even know the word, stunning, thrilling, gripping portrayal of what paradise was like before the fall, and what meant, like, that landed in me like a bomb. Like, life-changing to read that book, because you can see, because it's not really reflected too much in Genesis in a literary sense, because they weren't writing literature, right? Right. And C.S. Lewis is writing literature, and so he can spend the entire, third act of the book almost, like, just expounding on this paradisical way of being on this planet, and it's like, that's who we were. Like, yes. And then I go walking down the street to my gym, and I look at the trucks and the cars and the concrete. It's like, oh, we screwed up so bad.
Yeah. Oh no, it's no. Paralandra, I love that you brought that up, because the innocence of that that woman, or
the green lady,
the innocence, and like. He just does such a good job of, what would it be like to have no knowledge of sin and death, but to be interacting with someone who does, right?
Yeah.
Like, and then she says, you've made me wiser, like, I'm older now. Or no, that's what she says. I'm older now. And the way that, like, they talk about things, and I'm like, the innocence, I think, is what really stands out to me. And that is that childlikeness and that reliance upon, like, the fatherly care. And then in that book, it's Maladil, and she's like, why would I do anything to disobey Maladil? Like, he's good. Why would I do that? And you're like, oh, sin. Mm-hmm. That's what sin is. So no, I love that you brought that up. That is, I read that book twice. So I read the first book, and then I'm like, almost twice way through the second book. And then I've started the third book, but have yet to finish it. it's amazing.
Yeah. I've been waiting. I read it back in June, and I was loving the book. And then I think that to finish the book, I just couldn't put it down. I gave myself a little staycation. So I deleted all social media from my phone and disappeared from the world for about a week. I stayed here in my apartment, was out by the pool all day. When I was reading that book, it was during that week. And I think I stayed up until like 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning finishing it. Like I could not put it. I didn't want to put it down. Like I didn't want it to end. I still don't want it to end. Like I haven't actually, like, I'm going through like a something in my heart, like a breakup with those books. Like I read those books. I don't want to read any of the books again.
Yes. Okay. So can we talk about Space Trilogy?
Please. Okay. Buckle in.
So the fact that, okay, so I don't want to spoil anything. Well, okay,
yeah.
That's fine. Spoiler alert. Stop now if you don't want to know what happens. Okay. If the fact that when Ransom is deciding what route to take to deal with the unman, and he's called an unman because he has lost his humanity and he is controlled by the powers of darkness. He is not a man anymore, right? But when he's deciding what route to take, and you think at the beginning, it's going to be this intellectual battle of the wills, and like he's going to outsmart whatever. Mm-hmm. And he comes to that realization of, I literally have to kill this guy with my bare hands.
Yeah.
It just peels off like those Gnostic layers that we have in our thinking of like, because we're expecting this spiritual battle, and it turns into this aggressive, violent, bloody. He's not trying to convince this person anymore. He's not trying to, he is destroying them, because what's at stake is paradise. What's at stake is an entire refall. And there's this quote that I actually had in my house for a while from that book. And it was, whatever happens, Maldil will make good come of it, but not the good that if you had obeyed in the first place.
Oof. Yes.
And I'm like chills. And so anyway, this reality of how he's forced to deal with the disruption in paradise. Like, and you think about that with Adam and Eve, and Adam's job was not to reason with the snake. It was to make a full violent end of it and destroy it. And how like uncomfortable are we with that language now? Because we're closet Gnostics, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
So anyway, this is a whole other topic tangent, but I love.
No, please, I've been waiting for like 2 months to talk with somebody about this book. So, and I'm glad you brought that up, because, yes, it is definitely like it speaks to the Gnostic side. Like, no, you're not going to have a spiritual battle with the devil. Like, but what's interesting for me about reading the same thing is that, to me, it spoke to masculinity. Because here's Ransom, he's a philologist, like he's a professor, he's like a Cambridge professor. He's based on Tolkien, actually. And he realizes that all of his wisdom and all of his intelligence is absolutely powerless, and he has to use the one thing, and his body, to step up and end this threat. And she can't see him do it. Like, that's the thing, is like, it can't be in her sight. She can't witness this murder going down.
Yeah.
Right. Cause that would, and so the way that whole, that like how, but then to know during the course of reading the books that like Maladil's going to take care of all of it. And he does. It's just like, it's
even, and then the glorification afterwards.
Oh yeah.
You're like, what?
Yeah.
No, it's so glorious. My other favorite part of that book was the beginning, where they're talking about wrestling with the principalities and the in the heavenly places, and they're kind of referring to that verse in Ephesians. And he says something about like, it's really just like, man, I have the book in my shelf. I wish I could, but there's that quote where he's talking about, it's like, we're actually just fighting with psychosomatic powers. Like, that's a better translation of it or whatever. And like, I don't know, but it just brings it down to this level that's like, oh, this is war. Like, when we say we're wrestling with the powers and principalities and heavenly places, people are like, oh yeah, like got to put on my spiritual armor and like, you know, it's this vague sort of, but no, like there are,
Yeah.
and yeah, I have recommended that to multiple people because it will expand your idea of what it means to be a spiritual person living in this in this world.
Yeah, I live like I think about Paralandra every day because I'm forced to, because so you read the Bible, you read Genesis, and you read about creation and a little bit about the garden, and there's comparatively very little about it that's that we would describe as not sensual in like a sexual way, but sensual and like engages the senses. Lush, exactly.
Yeah.
And so we live in the world that's very opposite from the garden, but we don't have a basis for contrast. We can't understand because we can't actually we can look at paintings, but paintings don't quite do it. But C.S. Lewis is such an absolute genius and so incredible with words, and like he's so connected and so blessed and so holy in his gift, at least, that he's able to paint this picture that's like, you don't just get to look at it, you get to go inside the garden and see how it was. And I believe it was like a divine gift that was given to him. Like he tapped into something true. And then to see that and then to juxtapose it with who we are as people now, the world that we live in, just how fallen it is. Like I did a series on a series of stories on Instagram where I talked about the curse, like God's curses are legit. It's in my story highlights. And it was just after reading that book, because I realized how legit the curse was. Like God was not messing around. And you can't really understand that because you take for granted living in this sinful way our whole lives. You know, we take it for granted because we don't actually know what the alternative is. But to read those books and see what the alternative is and to feel it and to believe in it, it's gripping in the heart and crushing and heartbreaking, but also simultaneously the most faith inspiring thing that, no, that's who we were. And to your point about, calling to be understood.
Yeah.
Like that all those things that we have a longing for, they're real and genuine parts of us that will be filled.
Yes.
I mean, just transformative for me.
Yes. Yeah. No. I was thinking too about the world that he paints, because I love that you brought that up with like, we read about the garden and we're like, okay, so I just fill my understanding of a garden into the text and that's it. But when he paints this world, like it's like the experience of the senses. It's not just that the physical realm is untouched by sin, and so things taste good and it's nice to swim and whatever. But the experience of those is untainted by sin. So when he tastes that fruit, he doesn't have any, like, he's like, it would be almost sinful to repeat that experience. Like perfect satisfaction. I think that was what he was getting at, to be perfectly satisfied. And so, when, like you said, when we look at how we've been corrupted and how God's curses, like he was so kind to us in the garden, and to pervert something so beautiful deserves nothing less than the death sentence. And you see that in the garden. Like the unman deserved every ounce that was coming to him.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And it just really calls into stark contrast, I guess you'd say, like the power of salvation. Like we all fell in Adam and Eve, we all fell in Adam, but that whole experience, like our first parents, and just how fallen and broken the world is. But you know, time's corner. Oh, you know, that phrase that, you know, because the green lady knows about God coming down to earth. Like somehow she knows about that, right? Right. Like, and it's like that God condescended to become human, to sacrifice himself for our own redemption. It's like she called it time's corner, that it can be known in the heavens. It's like,
oh yeah, I know. I'm like on the verge of tears.
Yes.
Time's corner. Yeah. When everything changed.
Yes.
Yeah. Love that you brought that up.
It's the best. Literally, I've been waiting to talk about this book for 2 months. Because I don't want to give it away. Because I think we've done a good. I mean, I can't. Everyone will have their own experience, but
we gave the spoiler alert, so it's fine.
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't know that you really can. Yeah, you can give a spoiler alert, but I don't know that you can really even. For me, that wasn't the thing that could be spoiled. Like I don't know if you know what I mean.
It's an experience. It's not a plot that you're like, oh, okay, now I know what happens. It is an experience. So
yes,
they can dive into that experience regardless of what we've previously shared. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think we could like spoil the plot of it, but I mean that would only do so much, because to read it and to engage in it from a Christian viewpoint and to understand the gravity, the gravity of the garden, the gravity of the fall, the gravity of redemption, all is illustrated. Like, you know, been listening to some lectures about it because Doug Wilson talks about it. And, you know, he talks a lot about That Hideous Strength, which was a book of prophecy about, you know, how depraved our modern world will get. And, you know, Lewis was right in ways that he couldn't have even known. But and it's a great book. But like my heart belongs, like Ransom, my heart belongs to Paralandra.
Yeah. I love that. Now I need to read That Hideous Strength, though. I need to actually make that happen.
It's really good. The last act of the book, the first two acts are a little bit like, where is this going? What's going on? But the last act, third act of the book is like, whoa, like, whoa.
Okay. That's what I've heard. Yeah. My Orthodox friend, she just really kept recommending it to me, and it's just like, just wait, it will blow your mind. Just wait. Yeah. So good.
Yeah. Cause in That Hideous Strength, you also see some of the things that we've been talking about related to feminism and its effect on men and women because you see it in the protagonist. Ransom is not the protagonist of That Hideous Strength. It's on one side, it's two different stories that intertwine at the end, that follow a married couple. So Mark and Jane Studdock. And so one goes one way, the other goes the other way. And you see it show up like how men are fallen, how women are fallen, and the role of men and women, and how that all plays out. So you get to see it's very much more earthly than Paralandra, but I mean, he saw very, very clearly. It touches on feminism too, but without using the word, because he wrote it in like the 1940s. So I don't know if the word was really out there yet.
Yeah. All right. I need to get on that.
Yeah. All right. So I just did have one, just to bring it back to, you know, sort of practical things. I wanted to, you've interacted with obviously so many different content creators and so many content consumers, for lack of a better word. Like, what sort of advice do you give to women who want to make a transition to a more traditional lifestyle, whether to, you know, the things that really land for them in terms of addressing their thoughts, their behaviors, and also what sort of advice do you give to men as well? Because I'm sure you have many men followers, just like I have women followers. Like, what advice do you give to both men and women?
Yeah, if they're wanting to make that transition. Well, like, I think sometimes there will be an example in their minds of, this is the lifestyle that I want, copy and paste. But I remember when I was really seeking to change my lifestyle, but I was still working, and like, I didn't have the aesthetics, but my heart was changing. And so, like what we talked about earlier, I was wanting to make that physical manifestation of that. So, I was working at a grocery store, and I was thinking things like, okay, I'm here right now. This is where God has me. And how can I embrace my womanhood here? How can I love others here? How can I fulfill my calling here? And so that was helpful for me to not look at it as like a future event. When I get married, for the people listening, right? When I get married, I'll start really living this traditional life or whatever. Look at where you are right now. And for me, that was being a cashier at a grocery store and realizing that I had the opportunity to interact lovingly but like respectfully with customers, and that my work ethic was how I was glorifying God and, you know, fulfilling my calling at that time. So that's not specifically like traditional lifestyle, but I just bring that up to say, literally look at where you are right now and start with that. because there's always the next step. You know, for me, is once I have kids or once I'm full time at home or whatever. The other thing I would say is that if you are married, this is a conversation between you and your husband. And it's a really exciting conversation to get to have, because you get to figure out how you want to do things. And I remember when things were changing for the better in my marriage, and I would have these conversations with my husband about, me being more home full-time more, and what that would look like and how that would impact our lifestyle and the things that I would prioritize and blah, 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 blah. Those conversations were really, really exciting times to dream together about what our life could look like, if we're going down this path. So if you're married, open that up as a wonderful conversation that's exciting and that's full of possibility and warmth, and just dream together. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. Because I remember going from working at the full-time at the grocery store. I keep bringing up the grocery store because it was just such a formative time. And it was, anyway, I remember going from working full-time to working just a few hours a week at the coffee shop. That entire process did not happen overnight. It was slowly making changes in our lifestyle to be able to make that happen. And I started being content before I ended up as a stay-at-home mom. I started pursuing contentment when I was working full-time. And slowly, little by little, it was a long process of me being home with my son full-time. So I would just say, be in it for the long run. Have those conversations if you're married, with your husband, that are just beautiful, dreaming conversations of what your life could be, right? If you are wanting to get out of the stressful 9-to-5, and if you're not in a place where that can happen, if you have that conversation with your husband, because I get this message a lot of women wanting to be at home full time. Obviously it's going to depend on the situation, but if you're wanting to be home full time and that's not happening, don't nag about it. Let the matter rest and just pray about it for a while. And then once you've prayed about it and thought up a gentle way of resurfacing it in a way that's non-combative, then maybe try to bring that up. But I would just let it rest for a bit, so it's not this constantly harped on thing. And so, I'm not sure when someone says, I want to have a more traditional lifestyle. I'm like, what does that mean?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Do you want to be a stay-at-home wife? Okay, here are some things you can do. First, have that conversation. If it's a single woman and she's saying, I want to have a more traditional life, or more traditional lifestyle, then my advice to her would be, okay, sit down and examine everything that is keeping you back from that right now. So you're working this super stressful job. You're on birth control. You're blah, 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 blah. There's a whole slew of things that keep women in this stressed, unhappy, modern women state. And so I would sit down and say, this is a conversation you have with yourself or with a mentor or someone where you very, very honestly evaluate the things in your life that are pulling away from this stream. So, and I say that all within, if you don't know the Lord, you need to know the Lord first.
Yes.
That is
important.
That is first. A lot of times though, it is Christians reaching out, but they're still just lost because their church community is just kind of this wishy-washy, non-denominational, egalitarian, everything is, so they have no guidance, and then they have no guidance from their family. And so something I will tell people is, that you can do what you want with your life. I don't mean that in you're the master of your fate. I don't mean that, but I mean if you hate your job and you are super stressed and it is you don't even feel like a woman at this job because you are operating in such a masculine way, that you can look for other things to do. And it's oh yeah, you're right. Like it is my life. Like I can make those changes. People
Mm-hmm.
sometimes don't like connect the dots,
Right.
And so then I would give recommendations of things that women can do. This was a very, very stream of consciousness answer. So I hope those are helpful points. But things on the practical end that women can do if they're like, I still need to work, but I want to do a job that is not contributing to my stress and, requires me to climb the ladder and behave in a masculine manner. I would say you can make a lot of money being a nanny. I was a nanny for several years, and you are literally working with children and being nurturing. So that is an excellent job for women who are not, married yet. They're not stay-at-home wives or mothers yet. Look into that. Examine your life and be honest about what is and isn't working.
And it's okay to fake it until you make it too.
And it's okay to fake it until you make it. I did that for a lot.
Yeah. Just one more quick question, if that's okay. So, what is your perspective on the younger generation of girls and their relationship to feminism and the things that you talk about? Because I saw some statistics that said just yesterday, I think I posted them on Instagram, that women ages 18 to 35 are now far more liberal than men the same age bracket. And so maybe you're encountering alternate experiential data. Like what does it look like from your perspective?
Okay. Yeah. So again, I'm in a bubble in the sense that, yes, I have a large following, but it is generally like-minded people.
Sure.
And so that's what I'm getting. Something that's I've realized is you can literally, you can do every messed up thing in culture, in media or whatever, and women are still going to want to be stay-at-home wives and mothers deep, deep, deep down in their hearts. So they still love babies and want to have a slow paced, nurturing, creative life. So, and I see that, like, they might not know that they're admitting that, but I see things where I'm like, okay, you're admitting to this without admitting to it. So when I think of that younger generation, I'm like, it's not that I have to convince people to want something that isn't natural to them, right? It's more like showing them that it's okay and it's possible. So you're not fighting a losing battle in the sense that, like, women's innate femininity is something that can be crushed and suppressed and poisoned, but it's not something that ultimately can be destroyed, which is awesome. So you're not fighting a losing battle. We're not fighting a losing battle. Like a woman can be on birth control for 10 years and her hormones can be all over the place and she really doesn't know what she wants. And there can be a lot of odds working against her. But you're still dealing with a woman who wants to do womanly things. So I think it's less about, is this generation any different? I don't know. Like, I think that the same feminine heart is there. And it's just a new manifestation of wickedness that's trying to pull them away from it. And so our job is just to stand here and go, hey, it's okay to be a woman. It's okay to want lots of children. It's okay to love your husband. We just have to stand there and present it and just make it beautiful. Make the truth beautiful and love what we're doing.
Amen. Praise God.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Anneliese. This has been wonderful.
Thank you. This has been a great conversation.
So good. So good. Well, where can people go to find out more about you and what you do?
So I am on Instagram at feminine_not_feminist. And I have a podcast, Everyday Wife. And then, am I anywhere else? I'm on Twitter.
Yeah.
It's there.
It's a thing.
But I'm mostly active on Instagram. So.
Yeah. Well, thank you again. This has been an absolute blessing to me. And I'm just very grateful for everything I've learned from this conversation and from you. So thank you.
Thank you.